Hello everyone, I know you are watching this video to accompany your sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also don't forget to tell me where you are from, and what time you watched this video. Name's Sam Huxley, and I was a park ranger at Wolf Creek for 6 years. Notice I said was. These days I spend my time up north, as far from West Virginia as I could reasonably get without crossing into Canada. But let me back up a bit, because to understand what happened that night, you need to understand Wolf Creek itself. The reserve sits in a forgotten corner of West Virginia, one of those places that time seemed to skip over. It's mostly dense pine forest, the kind where the trees grow so close together they block out most of the sunlight, creating a permanent twilight on the forest floor. A river cuts through it like a jagged scar, eventually spilling into what we called Mirror Lake, though it's really more of a glorified pond. The locals mostly stayed away, which was fine by me. After what happened with my brother, I wasn't much for company anyway. Mike, that was my brother's name. He died of pancreatic cancer 2 years before all this went down. It was quick, brutally quick. By the time they caught it, it had already spread everywhere. I was working at Wolf Creek when he got sick, and I told myself I couldn't leave my post, that someone had to watch over the park. The truth is, I was scared. Scared to watch him waste away, scared to face what was happening. By the time I finally worked up the courage to take some leave, he was already gone. That guilt, it eats at you, you know, like rust on metal, slowly corroding everything it touches. The job helped in its way. There's something therapeutic about being alone in nature, about having nothing but trees and sky for company. Most days my biggest concern was making sure the few hikers who wandered through didn't leave their trash behind or start fires where they shouldn't. The occasional black bear would show up, but they generally kept their distance. It was peaceful, predictable work. That Thursday started like any other. I arrived for the evening shift just as the day ranger, Bill Martinez, was finishing up his rounds. Bill was an old-timer, been with the Park Service longer than I'd been alive. He had this way of moving through the forest like he was part of it, barely making a sound even with all his gear. Quiet day, he told me as he was packing up his stuff. Couple of hikers on the North Trail, but they headed out around noon. Weather's supposed to turn nasty tonight. I nodded, going through my pre-shift routine of checking equipment. Flashlight, radio, first aid kit, the usual stuff. Any word on those sounds people been talking about? Bill shrugged, but there was something in his expression, a tightness around his eyes that I hadn't seen before. Nothing concrete, but... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Just keep your eyes open tonight, Sam. Something ain't right in these woods lately. Coming from anyone else, I might have laughed it off. But Bill wasn't the type to spook easily. He'd seen mountain lions, dealt with aggressive bears, handled every kind of emergency the wilderness could throw at him. If something had him worried, it was worth paying attention to. The sun was already starting to set as I began my first round of checks. The air had that heavy feel to it that comes before a storm, thick and oppressive. The forecast had called for rain, but this felt different. The clouds hanging over the tree line were too dark, too still, like someone had painted them onto the sky. I made my way down to the old ranger station first. It was a decrepit thing, built back in the 60s when the park was first established. We mainly used it for storage now, keeping some emergency supplies and backup equipment there. The building had that particular smell that all abandoned places seem to share, a mixture of dust, mold, and decay that no amount of cleaning could quite eliminate. As I approached the station, I noticed something odd. The usual background noise of the forest, the constant chorus of birds, insects, and small animals, was starting to fade. At first, it was so gradual I barely noticed it, like someone slowly turning down the volume on a radio. But by the time I reached the station's front door, the silence was absolute. In 6 years of working these woods, I'd never heard anything like it. Even during the worst storms, there was always some sound. Wind in the trees, rain on the roof, something. This was different. This was wrong. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I reached for my radio, thinking I should check in with dispatch when I felt it. A vibration, so low at first I thought I was imagining it, running through the soles of my boots. It reminded me of standing near train tracks as a freight train passes. That deep, bone-rattling rumble that you feel more than hear. But there weren't any trains anywhere near Wolf Creek Reserve. There wasn't anything that could make a sound like that, at least nothing that was supposed to be there. That's when I heard the first scream. The scream wasn't human. I want to be clear about that right up front. It wasn't any animal I'd ever heard either, and in 6 years of working the park, I'd heard pretty much everything the local wildlife could produce. This was something else entirely. Something that started as a high-pitched keening before dropping into a register, so low it made my teeth ache. I pulled out my flashlight. Though the sun hadn't completely set yet, the beam seemed weak, barely penetrating the strange twilight that had settled over the forest. The vibration was getting stronger now, and I could hear something else beneath it, a wet, sliding sound like something massive moving through the underbrush. My training told me to call it in, to wait for backup before investigating any unusual situation. But when I keyed the radio, all I got was static. Not the usual kind that comes from being out of range, but a strange, pulsing static that seemed to sync up with the vibrations running through the ground. The smart thing would have been to get back to my vehicle and leave. That's what any rational person would have done. But I'd spent too many years in these woods to just abandon them at the first sign of trouble. Plus, if there was something dangerous out there, I needed to know about it. We had campers in the park most nights, even if none were registered for that particular evening. I started moving toward Mirror Lake, where the sound seemed to be coming from. The silence in the forest was getting more oppressive with each step, like the trees themselves were leaning in, watching my progress. The air had gotten thicker, too, almost soupy, and there was a smell I couldn't quite place, something ancient and organic, like the bottom of a long, undisturbed pond. As I approached the lake, the fog started rolling in. Now, fog isn't unusual around water, especially in the evening. But this was different. It moved wrong, crawling across the ground in thick tendrils that seemed to reach out like fingers. The fog was dense enough that I had to slow down, careful not to lose my footing on the increasingly slick ground. That's when I saw the water start to move. Mirror Lake had always lived up to its name. The surface was usually so still it looked like glass, perfectly reflecting the sky and surrounding trees. But now the surface was rippling, though there wasn't a breath of wind. The ripples weren't moving outward from a central point either, like they would if something had disturbed the water. Instead, they were moving in spiral patterns, as if the lake itself was slowly beginning to rotate. I'd reached the edge of the treeline now, standing maybe 30 feet from the water's edge. The vibrations had gotten strong enough that small pebbles were dancing on the ground, and the air felt electrically charged, like just before a lightning strike. The fog was thicker here, swirling around my legs in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. I swept my flashlight beam across the water's surface, and that's when I caught the first glimpse of what was waiting in the lake. Just for a second, illuminated by the weak beam of my light, I saw something break the surface, something that looked like scales, but each one was the size of dinner plate, glistening with an oily iridescence that made my eyes hurt to look at. It disappeared almost instantly, sliding back beneath the water with barely a ripple. But that brief glimpse was enough to send my heart racing. Whatever I'd seen, it was big, much bigger than anything that should have been able to survive in a lake this size. I started backing away slowly, trying to keep my movements smooth and controlled. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but years of dealing with wildlife had taught me that running was usually the worst thing you could do. Predators chase what runs. That's when I heard it again, that impossible scream. But this time it was closer, much closer. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating through the trees and setting my teeth on edge. The water in the lake began to churn, no longer moving in neat spirals but thrashing violently, as if something massive was thrashing beneath the surface. I took another step back, and my boot caught on something, a root or a stone, I'm still not sure. I stumbled, catching myself against a tree trunk, but in that moment of distraction, I lost sight of the water. When I looked back, the thing was already emerging. It rose from the lake like a mountain being born, water cascading off its massive form in sheets. In the growing darkness, I couldn't make out its full shape at first, just an impossibly large silhouette that kept rising and rising, blocking out what remained of the twilight sky. The beam of my flashlight caught it again, and this time I got a clear look at what we were dealing with. I wish to God I hadn't. The creature that emerged from Mirror Lake defied everything I thought I knew about biology, about what was possible in our world. Its head alone was larger than my truck, shaped like something between a snake and a crocodile, but wrong in ways that made my mind recoil. The scales I'd glimpsed earlier covered its entire body, each one shifting color like oil on water, creating patterns that seemed to move independently of the creature's movements. But it was the eyes that truly haunted me. They were huge, easily the size of car tires, and completely black, not just dark, but the absence of light itself. Looking into them was like staring into the space between stars, a void so complete it seemed to pull at your sanity. and they were fixed directly on me. The creature's body continued to rise from the lake, water streaming off its form in torrents. It moved with an impossible grace for something of its size, its massive form flowing out of the water like liquid mercury. The low rumbling sound I'd been feeling through the ground was coming from it, a sound so deep it made my bones vibrate. I'd like to say I did something heroic at that moment, that I stood my ground or came up with some clever plan. But the truth is I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for stealth or direction. All I knew was that I had to get away from those eyes, from that thing that shouldn't exist. Behind me, I could hear the creature moving, the sound of trees snapping like twigs as it pursued me through the forest. The ground shook with each movement it made, and that terrible rumbling grew louder, mixing with a sound like steam escaping from a massive pressure valve. I ran until my lungs were burning, until spots danced in front of my eyes from lack of oxygen. But I couldn't stop. The old ranger station was somewhere ahead of me. I could barely make out its dark outline through the trees. It wasn't much, but it was the only shelter within reach. As I sprinted toward the station, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The creature was moving through the forest like a river of living metal, its massive body flowing between the trees with impossible fluidity. Where it touched the ground, the earth seemed to blacken and steam, as if its very presence was toxic to the natural world. I slammed into the station's door with enough force to nearly take it off its hinges, scrambling inside and throwing the bolt. For whatever good that would do against something that size, the building's old walls suddenly seemed absurdly fragile, like a child's dollhouse facing down a bulldozer. Inside the station, I could hear the creature circling the building. The walls creaked and groaned as it brushed against them, testing their strength. I knew I had only moments before it found a way in. The gun locker was on the far wall, standard issue shotgun and ammunition locked inside. The keys were hanging by the door, but to reach them I'd have to get dangerously close to the windows. That's when I noticed something else. The temperature in the room was dropping rapidly. I could see my breath misting in front of my face, and frost was beginning to form on the windows. The creature's proximity seemed to be affecting the very air around it, pulling the heat out of everything it came near. I had to make a choice. Stay where I was and hope the building would somehow protect me, or make a dash for the gun locker and at least have a fighting chance. The decision was made for me when the wall to my left suddenly bulged inward, with splintering as something massive pressed against it. I dove for the keys, snatched them off their hook, and scrambled toward the locker. Behind me, I heard the wall finally give way with a deafening crack. Cold air rushed in, bringing with it that overwhelming smell of ancient things and decay. I could feel the creature's presence behind me, could practically sense those void-like eyes fixed on my back. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get the key into the locker's lock. I could hear the creature moving inside the station now, its massive body somehow flowing through an opening that should have been too small for it. The temperature had dropped so low that my fingers were going numb, making it even harder to work the lock. Finally, the lock clicked open. I grabbed the shotgun and a handful of shells, turned, and found myself face to face with a nightmare. The creature had gotten its head and part of its body into the station, and in the confined space, it seemed even larger than before. Its scales were constantly shifting color now, creating patterns that hurt my eyes to look at. The air around it wavered like a heat mirage, except instead of heat, it was radiating intense cold. I loaded the shotgun with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else, chambered around, and fired directly at the creature's head. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space, but what happened next was even more shocking. Where the buckshot hit, the creature's scales seemed to absorb the impact, rippling like water before settling back into place. The creature reacted though, rearing back with a screech that shattered every window in the station. I used that moment to slam more shells into the gun, but I knew I was running out of options. The cold was getting worse, and I could feel my movements becoming sluggish. That's when I noticed something. Where the creature had touched the walls and floor, there were marks. Not just physical damage, but something else. The wood looked aged, decades of decay happening in minutes. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just physically dangerous. It was somehow affecting time itself around it. I fired again, this time aiming for one of those massive eyes. The shot went wide, but it gave me an idea. The creature might be armored, but surely it had vulnerable spots. I just had to find them. The thing lunged forward, its massive jaws snapping at the space where I'd been standing moments before. I rolled to the side, coming up against the old wooden desk that had been pushed into a corner. The movement brought me closer to the creature than I'd wanted to be, and I could see details I wish I hadn't, like the way its scales seemed to move independently of each other, or how there were smaller, darker shapes moving beneath its semi-transparent skin. I fired again, this time hitting the softer area under its jaw. The creature recoiled, and for the first time, I saw something that looked like actual damage, a dark fluid that might have been blood seeping from between its scales. But my small victory was short-lived. The creature's reaction was immediate and violent. It thrashed, bringing down half the station's roof in the process. I barely managed to dodge a falling beam, but the movement put me in a corner. I was trapped. The temperature had dropped so low that frost was forming on my clothes. My movements were becoming more difficult, and I knew I couldn't last much longer in this cold. The creature seemed to sense my weakening, taking its time now as it moved toward me, those black eyes fixed on my face. That's when I saw it, the old emergency flare gun, still mounted on the wall behind me. It was ancient, probably hadn't been checked in years, but it was my only option left. I grabbed it, praying it would still work. The creature lunged again, and I fired the flare directly into its open mouth. For a split second, nothing happened, and my heart sank. Then the flare ignited. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The creature's entire head lit up from within, its semi-transparent flesh glowing an awful, sickly red. It reared back with a shriek that threatened to burst my eardrums, thrashing wildly in the confined space of the station. Where the flare's light touched its flesh, the creature's scales began to bubble and melt, revealing something underneath that looked less like flesh and more like living darkness. I didn't waste the opportunity. I reloaded the shotgun and started firing systematically at the areas the flare had weakened. Each shot tore away more of the creature's outer layer, revealing more of that impossible darkness beneath. The cold was intense now, far beyond anything natural. My fingers were turning blue, and each breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. But the creature was weakening. Its movements became more erratic, less fluid. The darkness beneath its scales seemed to be leaking out like smoke, dissipating in the frigid air. With each shot, more of it seemed to lose cohesion, parts of its massive body literally evaporating into the air. Then something happened that I still can't properly explain. As the creature thrashed in its death throes, reality itself seemed to warp around it. The air buckled and twisted, and for a brief moment I saw something else. Through the holes I'd blown in its flesh, I caught glimpses of what looked like another place entirely. A vast, dark space filled with shapes that moved in ways that shouldn't be possible. The creature made one final, desperate lunge at me. I emptied the last of my shells into its head, and suddenly everything stopped. The cold, the otherworldly glimpses, even the sound, it all just ceased. The creature's massive body collapsed, partially inside the station and partially out, already beginning to dissolve into a thick, dark liquid that steamed in the night air. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for it to move again, to regenerate, to do something. But it just continued to dissolve, leaving behind nothing but a dark stain on the wood and a lingering smell of ozone and decay. The authorities arrived just before dawn. I'd managed to get the radio working again after the creature died, though the signal was still weak and full of strange interference. I don't think they really believed me at first. Who would? But when they saw the devastation at the ranger station, the massive track marks in the earth, and the dark stains that seemed to be eating into the wood, wherever the creature had touched, they had to accept that something had happened. The next few days were a blur of interviews, reports, and medical examinations. They found traces of severe frostbite on my extremities, though I hadn't even noticed in the adrenaline of the moment. The doctors couldn't explain how I developed such severe cold damage on a warm summer night. The government sent in a team of specialists, they never said from which agency, who spent weeks studying the site. They took samples of everything, the stained wood, the soil, even core samples from the trees near where the creature had passed. They drained Mirror Lake completely, though they never said what, if anything, they found at the bottom. What bothered me most was what they didn't find. There should have been a body, or at least remains of some kind. Something that big doesn't just disappear without a trace. But by the time the authorities arrived, all that was left were those strange stains and the damage to the forest. Even those began to fade after a few weeks, like the land itself was trying to forget what had happened. The park was officially closed for environmental assessment. They strung up chain-link fences and posted armed guards. Last I heard they're still there, though no one seems to know exactly what they're guarding against. In the months that followed, I spent a lot of time trying to make sense of what had happened. I researched cryptozoology, folklore, even quantum physics, anything that might explain what I'd seen. I found plenty of stories about lake monsters and forest creatures, but nothing that quite matched what I'd encountered. The closest I came to an answer was in some old local histories I found in the county library. Turns out the Native Americans who originally lived in the area had stories about a place in the forest they called the thin space, where the boundary between our world and somewhere else was weak. They avoided the area entirely, especially during certain times of the year, when the barrier was supposedly at its thinnest. The location they described matched almost exactly with where Mirror Lake now sits. The lake itself isn't natural. It was created in the 1960s when they dammed up part of Wolf Creek to create a reservoir. I can't help but wonder if maybe they disturbed something that should have been left alone. I've had a lot of time to think about what I saw that night, especially about those glimpses I caught through the creature's wounded flesh. Sometimes I wake up in a cold sweat, remembering those impossible geometries, that sense of something vast and ancient looking back at me through those void-like eyes. The experience changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. The physical effects were easy enough to deal with. The frostbite healed, though my fingers still ache when the weather turns cold. But the psychological impact? That's been harder to shake. I can't look at large bodies of water anymore without feeling a creeping dread. The sight of fog rolling sets my heart racing. Even normal, everyday sounds, like the rumble of distant thunder or the vibration of a passing truck, can send me right back to that night. But the worst part is the dreams. They started a few weeks after the incident and haven't really stopped. In them, I'm back at Mirror Lake, but everything is wrong. The water flows upward, the trees grow in impossible angles, and that thing is always there, watching me with those black, empty eyes. Sometimes I think I understand what it's trying to tell me, but I always wake up before I can grasp it fully. The doctors call it PTSD, prescribed medications and therapy. They mean well, but how do you process something that shouldn't be possible? How do you move on when you've seen proof that everything you thought you knew about reality is wrong? These days, I live up near the Canadian border, in a small cabin surrounded by pine forests. It's peaceful here most of the time. The locals are friendly, but keep to themselves, which suits me just fine. I took a job as a fire lookout, plenty of solitude, but far from any large bodies of water. I still get letters sometimes from researchers, cryptozoologists, and conspiracy theorists who've heard about what happened at Wolf Creek. They all want interviews, details, proof. I don't respond anymore. What would I tell them? That there are things in this world that don't fit into any of our neat little categories? That sometimes the line between what's possible and what isn't is thinner than we think. The government keeps sending me checks, consultation fees they call them, though I haven't consulted on anything. I think it's hush money, but I would have kept quiet anyway. Who'd believe me? Sometimes, on particularly clear nights, I sit on my cabin's porch and look up at the stars. They don't comfort me like they used to. Now, when I look at that vast darkness between the stars, I can't help but wonder if something is looking back. I think about those glimpses I caught through the creature's wounded flesh, about that other place I saw. I've come to believe that what I encountered wasn't just some undiscovered species or mutated creature. It was something else entirely, maybe a visitor from somewhere beyond our understanding, or maybe something that's always been here, hiding in the dark places of our world. Either way, I know one thing for certain. That night at Wolf Creek wasn't an ending. It was just the first sign of something bigger, something that's still out there waiting. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right and the shadows grow long, I swear I can still hear that deep rumbling sound, coming from somewhere far away, but getting closer. I keep the shotgun loaded these days, though I know it probably won't do much good if something like that ever shows up again. But it helps me sleep at night, knowing it's there. That's about all any of us can do, really. Keep our weapons close, stay away from dark water, and hope that whatever lies beyond that thin space between worlds decides to stay on its side of the divide. But deep down, I know better. Whatever that thing was, wherever it came from, it was just the beginning. There are more out there, and sooner or later they'll find their way through. I was never much of a camper. Growing up in Manhattan, where the closest thing to wildlife was the occasional rat scurrying across the subway tracks, I developed an almost instinctive aversion to anything that couldn't be reached by public transportation. The city was my sanctuary, a concrete jungle where every corner held something familiar, the smell of street vendor hot dogs, the endless symphony of car horns, the warm glow of streetlights that never quite let the darkness settle in. My brother Felix was different. While I found comfort in the predictable chaos of urban life, He seemed to draw energy from its absence. Born just 15 months after me, we shared the same dark hair and sharp features inherited from our mother. But that's where the similarities ended. Where I was tense and calculating, Felix moved through life with an easy grace, as if he'd somehow learned the secret to staying calm in a world that never stopped moving. We grew up in a fifth-floor walk-up in the Lower East Side, where money was always tight, but love wasn't. Our parents worked double shifts to keep us fed and clothed. Mom as a nurse at Beth Israel, Dad doing whatever odd jobs he could find between his regular gig as a superintendent. Felix and I shared a bedroom until I was 17, a cramped space where we'd lie awake at night, talking about everything and nothing. Even then, the differences between us were clear. I'd talk about my dreams of becoming a financial analyst, of making enough money to buy Mom and Dad a proper house. Felix would describe the mountains he'd seen in magazines, the forests he wanted to explore, the silence he craved. I never understood it, but I loved him for it. He was my little brother, and his dreams, however foreign they seemed to me, were as valid as my own. By 1997, we'd both managed to carve out our own paths. I had my entry-level position at a mid-sized investment firm, complete with a tiny studio apartment in Murray Hill that cost more than it should. Felix had taken a different route, working as an outdoor equipment specialist at REI, spending his weekends leading hiking groups through the Catskills, and his vacation days exploring increasingly remote locations. When he called me that spring evening, his voice crackling with excitement over my landline, I knew he wanted something. "Ivan," he said, not bothering with a greeting, "I found this place in Montana. It's called Needle Creek, and it's absolutely perfect. Pristine wilderness, barely any human traffic, and the most incredible rock formations you've ever seen." I leaned back in my desk chair, already knowing where this was heading. "Felix, just hear me out," he interrupted. "I've got all the gear we need. 2 weeks of vacation time saved up. It'll be like when we were kids, just the two of us. When's the last time we did something together, really together?" He had me there. Between my 60-hour work weeks and his endless outdoor excursions, we'd barely seen each other in months. The guilt must have shown in my silence because he pressed on. "Look, I know it's not your thing, but I've done all the research. The weather will be perfect this time of year, and I've got maps, supplies, everything we need. I even got those fancy freeze-dried meals you liked when we went to the Adirondacks." I remembered that trip, my first and only camping experience until then. It had been a disaster by any objective measure, with rain that wouldn't stop and mosquitoes that seemed to find me regardless of how much repellent I used. But I also remembered Felix's patience, how he'd taught me to start a fire even with wet wood, how we'd stayed up late sharing stories in a flask of whiskey. "When?" I asked, already knowing I'd regret this. 2 weeks from Saturday," he replied, trying and failing to hide the triumph in his voice. "I'll pick you up at 6 in the morning sharp." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "You know I'm going to hate every minute of this, right?" He laughed, that warm, genuine sound that always made everything seem a little less serious. "Maybe, but you'll remember it forever. Trust me on this one, big brother. If I'd known then what I know now, I would have said no. I would have made up an excuse, work emergency, sudden illness, anything to stay in my safe, predictable city life. But I didn't know, and neither did Felix. So I said yes, and that decision would change everything." Felix's Toyota Corolla looked like it had survived several wars, most of them poorly. The once red paint had faded to a patchy pink, and rust had claimed significant territory along the wheel wells. But according to Felix, it was trail-tested, whatever that meant. He'd picked me up exactly at 6, true to his word, and we'd been on the road for hours, watching the urban sprawl of the East Coast gradually give way to increasingly rural landscapes. "You know," Felix said, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel as we crossed into Montana, "there's something special about this place. The locals don't talk about it much, but there's history here. Old history." I was half listening, more focused on the way the car seemed to shake whenever we hit speeds above 60. "What kind of history?" "Native American legends, mostly. The Blackfeet called this area the place where shadows walk. They avoided it, especially at night. There are stories about people going missing, about sounds that couldn't be explained." I shot him a look. "You're not helping your case here." He grinned. But there was something else in his expression, a flicker of something I couldn't quite read. "I'm not trying to scare you. I just think it's fascinating. All these stories passed down through generations, and nobody really knows what's true and what isn't." The highway had given way to smaller roads, then to gravel, and finally to what could generously be called a trail. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches creating a tunnel effect that made me feel increasingly claustrophobic. The car bounced and rattled over every bump, and I found myself gripping the door handle with white-knuckled intensity. "How much further?" I asked, trying to keep the anxiety out of my voice. "Another hour, maybe less," Felix replied, his eyes scanning the rough path ahead. The trailhead's not marked on most maps. I found it through some hiking forums. People say it's one of the most pristine areas left in the state. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak as we navigated another particularly rough patch. The forest seemed to grow denser with each passing mile, the trees older and more gnarled. The afternoon light filtered through the canopy in strange patterns, creating shifting shadows that played tricks on my eyes. We finally reached the trailhead, just as the sun was beginning to set. It was marked by a simple wooden sign, weather-beaten and barely legible. Needle Creek Trail. Below it, someone had carved something in smaller letters, but time and elements had rendered it unreadable. Felix parked the car in a small clearing, killing the engine. The sudden silence was overwhelming, no traffic noise, no human sounds at all, just the whisper of wind through trees and the distant sound of running water. "Home sweet home," Felix said, climbing out of the car and stretching. "At least for the next few days." I followed him, less enthusiastically, and helped unload our gear. Felix had packed everything with military precision. Tents, sleeping bags, food, water filters, first aid supplies, and 2 old hunting rifles that looked like they'd seen better days. "Are those really necessary?" I asked, eyeing the weapons warily. Felix shrugged, checking them with practiced ease. "Probably not, but Dad always said it's better to have them and not need them than the other way around. Besides, there are bears in these parts. Mountain lions, too." The mention of predators didn't help my growing unease, but I tried to focus on the practical aspects of our situation. Felix showed me how to properly adjust my backpack, making sure the weight was distributed evenly. As I watched him work, I was struck by how different he seemed out here. In the city, he always looked slightly out of place, like a wild animal in captivity. But here, among the trees and silence, he moved with absolute confidence. "Ready?" he asked, shouldering his own pack. I took one last look at the car, our last connection to civilization. "As I'll ever be." Felix checked his compass, oriented himself with the rough map he'd brought, and started down the trail. I followed, trying to ignore the feeling that the forest was watching us. That each step took us further from the world I understood, and deeper into something else entirely. The sound of Needle Creek grew louder as we walked, though we couldn't see it yet through the dense undergrowth. The trail itself was barely visible in places, more suggested than defined. Felix moved surely ahead of me, occasionally pointing out different plants or animal tracks that meant nothing to my city-trained eyes. As we hiked deeper into the wilderness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hold something waiting to emerge. But Felix kept moving forward, and I followed, because that's what I'd always done. By the time we found a suitable camping spot, the sun was low in the sky, painting the forest in shades of amber and deep shadow. Felix had chosen a small clearing near the creek, where the ground was relatively flat, and the water ran clear over rocks that did indeed seem to rise like needles from the riverbed. "This is perfect," Felix said, dropping his pack and surveying the area with obvious satisfaction. "Good sight lines, close to water, and the ground's dry enough for comfortable sleeping." I was less enthusiastic, noting how the surrounding trees seemed to lean inward, creating a natural amphitheater that made me feel exposed rather than protected. But I kept my concerns to myself, focusing instead on helping Felix set up camp. We worked efficiently, Felix directing, and me following his lead. The tents went up without too much trouble, modern designs that were mercifully simpler than the complicated structures I remembered from our childhood camping trips. Felix showed me how to properly store our food, hanging it from a high branch to keep it away from curious wildlife. As darkness began to settle in, Felix got a fire going. The flames cast dancing shadows on the surrounding trees, and for a moment I could almost understand what drew him to places like this. The silence wasn't complete. There was the constant murmur of the creek, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant call of some night bird. But it was different from the city's endless noise. It was more intentional somehow. "Hungry?" Felix asked, already pulling supplies from his pack. He'd brought a small camping stove, but insisted on cooking over the open fire. "Nothing tastes better than bacon and beans in the wilderness," he declared, setting up a small grill over the flames. I watched him work, noting how at ease he seemed. You really love this, don't you? I asked. Being out here, away from everything? He nodded, stirring the beans thoughtfully. It's like, in the city, everything's artificial. The lights, the sounds, even the air we breathe. Out here, everything's real, raw. When you strip away all the distractions, you can finally hear yourself think. I think too much already, I muttered. But there was no bite in it. The food smelled good. Despite my reservations about this whole adventure, I found myself relaxing slightly. We ate in comfortable silence, the kind that only siblings can share. The beans were better than they had any right to be, and the bacon was perfect. After dinner, Felix pulled out a flask of whiskey, the same brand we'd shared on our Adirondacks trip. For old time's sake, he said, passing it to me. I took a sip, feeling the familiar burn. Remember how Dad used to take us fishing, not camping, just day trips to that little lake upstate? Felix laughed. Yeah, we never caught anything worth keeping, but he was so patient. Always said it wasn't about the fish anyway. You would have loved this place, I said softly. Felix's expression grew distant. Yeah, he would have. Our father had passed away 2 years earlier, a heart attack that no one saw coming. The loss had hit Felix particularly hard. They'd shared that love of the outdoors, that need to escape the city's confines. The fire crackled, sending sparks up into the darkening sky. Above us, stars were beginning to appear, more than I'd ever seen in the city. The Milky Way was visible, a river of light across the black velvet of the sky. Beautiful, isn't it? Felix said, following my gaze. You can't see this in Manhattan, too much light pollution. I had to admit he was right. It was beautiful, in a way that made me feel small and insignificant. But there was something else too, something I couldn't quite put into words. The darkness between the stars seemed deeper out here, more absolute. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped significantly. We added more wood to the fire, but the cold seemed to creep in from all sides. The forest had grown quieter, the ambient sounds dropping away until all we could hear was the creak and the pop and crack of burning wood. We should get some sleep, Felix said eventually, checking his watch. We've got a long hike tomorrow, if we want to reach the upper valley. I nodded, though the idea of sleeping out here, with only a thin layer of nylon between me and whatever lurked in the darkness, wasn't particularly appealing. Felix must have sensed my unease. Don't worry, he said, gently punching my shoulder. I've done this hundreds of times. Nothing out here is interested in us. If only he'd been right. Sleep didn't come easily. Despite the exhaustion from the day's hike, I found myself lying awake in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest. Felix had insisted we set up separate tents, something about developing self-reliance in the wilderness, and I was beginning to regret agreeing to that arrangement. The darkness was absolute, different from the city's artificial night. Even with my eyes fully adjusted, I could barely see the outline of my hand in front of my face. The sounds were different, too. In Manhattan, there was always some ambient noise, traffic, distant sirens, the hum of air conditioners. Here, every sound stood out with startling clarity: the rush of the creek, the whisper of wind through trees, the occasional snap of a twig that made my heart race. I must have dozed off eventually, because I remember dreaming. I was back in our old apartment, standing in the kitchen while Mom made breakfast. But something was wrong. The windows were dark, impossibly dark, and when Mom turned around, her face was obscured by shadows that shouldn't have been there. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was, and the panic was overwhelming. Then reality settled back in, the tent, the sleeping bag, Needle Creek. But something had woken me, something beyond the natural transition from dream to wakefulness. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. The night had changed. The usual forest sounds had gone quiet, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press against my ears. Then I heard it, a low, rumbling sound, like distant thunder, but somehow wrong. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, resonating at a frequency that made my teeth ache. "Felix," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't thunder. It was too sustained, too deliberate. It reminded me of the subway trains passing beneath the city streets, but deeper, more primal. And there was something else in it. Something that spoke to a part of my brain I didn't usually acknowledge, the part that remembered when humans were prey. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The beam seemed pathetically weak against the darkness outside the tent. I could see Felix's tent, just a few yards away, still and silent. "Felix," I called again, louder this time. I saw movement in his tent, then heard the rustle of his sleeping bag. "Ivan?" His voice was thick with sleep. "What's wrong?" "Listen," I whispered. For a moment there was nothing but the normal sounds of the forest. I began to wonder if I'd imagined it all, if the unfamiliar environment was playing tricks on my mind. Then it came again, and this time I heard Felix's sharp intake of breath. The sound was closer now, close enough that I could feel it in my chest, a vibration that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly with my bones. Felix unzipped his tent, and I saw the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Get the rifles," he said, his voice tense but controlled. "Slowly, don't make any sudden movements." I crawled out of my tent, moving as quietly as possible. The night air was cold against my face. The cold night air bit at my exposed skin as I fumbled with the rifle. Felix was already in motion, his movements precise and controlled, despite the fear I could sense radiating from him. The rumbling sound grew closer, seeming to come from all directions at once. Our fire had died down to embers, casting just enough light to make the shadows deeper, more threatening. The moonlight filtered through the canopy in strange patterns, creating shifting shapes that played tricks on our eyes. "Stay close," Felix whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of my pounding heart. "Whatever happens, don't run unless I say so." I nodded, though I wasn't sure he could see it. The forest had gone completely silent, no wind in the trees, no creek sounds, no nocturnal animals. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath. Then we saw it. The creature emerged from between two ancient pines, moving with an impossible fluidity that defied natural law. In the dim light its form seemed to shift and change, but certain details burned themselves into my memory. Limbs too long and thin to support any known creature, joints that bent in ways that made my stomach turn, and a head that seemed more like a nightmare's interpretation of a skull than anything that belonged in our world. Felix fired first, the crack of the rifle shattering the unnatural silence. The creature didn't flinch. It turned its head toward us with a terrible slowness, and I felt its gaze like ice water in my veins. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, were deep, empty pits that seemed to pull at something inside me. I fired next, my hand shaking so badly I'm surprised I could pull the trigger at all. The bullets seemed to pass through it as if it were made of smoke, but the trees behind it splintered from the impacts. The creature opened its mouth, a gash that split its head nearly in half, and released a sound that made my knees buckle. It was like every nightmare I'd ever had given voice, a sound that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to the primitive part of my brain that remembered when humans were prey. "Run!" Felix screamed, grabbing my arm and yanking me into motion. We crashed through the underbrush, blind panic driving us forward. I could hear it behind us, moving with a speed that nothing that size should possess. The sound of its pursuit was wrong, not the crash of vegetation or the thud of footfalls, but a smooth, continuous rushing noise, like wind through a tunnel. Felix led the way, somehow maintaining his sense of direction even in the chaos. I followed, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. The creature was getting closer. I could feel its presence behind me, a cold pressure that made my skin crawl. Just when I thought we couldn't run another step, Felix spotted the cave. It was little more than a crack in a rocky outcropping, barely visible in the darkness. We dove inside, pressing ourselves against the cold stone walls. The opening was too small for the creature to follow, at least that's what we hoped. We heard it outside, moving around the entrance. The sound it made was different now, a low, rhythmic pulsing that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. It stayed there for what felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that small, dark space. Eventually, the sounds faded. We stayed in the cave until the light of dawn began to filter through the trees, neither of us willing to risk leaving our shelter in the darkness. The morning light revealed the true extent of what had happened. The ground where the creature had moved was changed, not just disturbed, but fundamentally altered. The earth was scorched in a pattern that followed its path, and the vegetation had withered and blackened, as if it had been exposed to intense cold rather than heat. Our campsite was destroyed, the tents were shredded, our supplies scattered. The trees around the clearing bore deep gouges that no natural animal could have made. But it was the smell that hit me hardest, a sharp, metallic odor that reminded me of ozone after a lightning strike, mixed with something older and more primitive. Felix moved through the wreckage methodically, gathering what supplies he could salvage. His hands were steady, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the tree line. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice hoarse. "Now." He nodded, but something in his expression made me uneasy. There was a look in his eyes I'd never seen before, a mixture of fear and fascination that sent a chill down my spine. "Did you see how it moved?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. It wasn't natural. Nothing about it was natural. "Felix," I said sharply, "we need to go." He seemed to shake himself out of whatever trance he'd fallen into. Yeah, you're right." We gathered what we could carry and started the long trek back to the car. The forest felt different in daylight, but not in a reassuring way. The shadows seemed deeper than they should be, the silence more complete. Even the creek's sound seemed muted, as if the water itself was trying to avoid drawing attention. The journey back to civilization was a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. Every snapped twig made us jump, every shadow held potential horrors. Felix drove mechanically, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, while I kept watching the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us. The transition back to the familiar world of highways and gas stations felt surreal. How could everything look so normal, so unchanged, when we'd experienced something that defied reality itself? The fluorescent lights of a roadside diner, where we stopped for coffee, seemed harsh and artificial, but I welcomed their unnatural glow. At least they were human-made, comprehensible. We barely spoke during the drive. What was there to say? Any attempt to put our experience into words seemed inadequate, almost disrespectful to the sheer otherworldliness of what we'd witnessed. But I could see the wheels turning in Felix's mind, could sense him trying to make sense of it all. When he finally dropped me off at my apartment in Manhattan, the city felt both familiar and strange, like a photograph that's slightly out of focus. The constant noise and light that had once irritated me now felt comforting, a shield against the darkness we'd encountered. "Take care of yourself, Ivan," Felix said as I got out of the car. His voice was different, older somehow, weighted with knowledge we were never meant to have. "You too," I replied, knowing even then that something fundamental had changed between us. As I watched his taillights disappear into the night traffic, I had a sinking feeling that this wouldn't be the end of it. Felix called me 3 months later. His voice was excited, almost feverish, as he told me about another location he'd found, even more remote than Needle Creek. "There are patterns, Ivan," he said, speaking quickly. "Places where the boundaries are thin, where things can cross over. I've been researching, talking to people who've had similar experiences. We're not the only ones who've seen it." "Felix, please," I begged, "let it go. Whatever it was, whatever we saw, we were lucky to survive. But don't you see? That's exactly why we can't ignore it. People need to know, they need to understand what's out there." I tried to talk him out of it, but I knew it was useless. Felix had always been stubborn, and now he had a purpose, an obsession that I could hear burning in every word. 2 weeks later, I got the call from the rangers. They'd found his campsite in the Bitterroot Mountains, tent still standing, gear laid out neatly, fire pit cold but recently used. But Felix was gone. No blood, no signs of struggle, just emptiness where my brother should have been. The search lasted for weeks. I flew out to Montana, joined the rescue teams, combed through miles of wilderness. But deep down, I knew we wouldn't find him. Whatever had taken him, whether it was the same thing we'd encountered at Needle Creek or something equally unknowable, it hadn't left anything for us to find. I couldn't stay in New York after that. The city that had once been my sanctuary now felt confining, artificial. I moved to a small town in Colorado, where the mountains loom on the horizon and the stars are visible at night. I don't go into the wilderness anymore. I've learned my lesson about that. But sometimes on clear nights, I sit on my porch and look up at the vast expanse of sky. And sometimes, when the wind is right, I hear something in the distance, a low, resonant sound that makes my bones ache with remembered fear. When that happens, I think about Felix, about whatever drove him back into the darkness. Was it curiosity? Obsession? Or did something call to him, pulling him back like a fish on a line? I'll never know for sure, but I've made my peace with that. More or less. There are things in this world that we're not meant to understand, places we're not meant to go. Felix found one of those places, and it consumed him, just as it almost consumed me. So I stay in my small town, living a quiet life, and I try not to think too much about what might be out there in the darkness. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of Needle Creek, of shadows that move wrong and sounds that shouldn't exist. And in those dreams, I see Felix, walking deeper into the forest, following something that I can never quite see. And I wake up knowing that whatever took my brother is still out there, still hunting, still waiting in the places where the shadows are deepest, and the silence speaks volumes. But it's not my fight anymore. I've learned to live with the knowledge that some questions are better left unanswered, some mysteries better left unsolved, because sometimes the price of understanding is too high to pay. The construction site's familiar chaos faded behind me as I pulled out of Charlotte, my old Winnebago, groaning under the weight of a week's worth of supplies. The open road stretched before me, a ribbon of asphalt promising escape from the memories that haunted every corner of the empty house I once shared with Clara. My name's Quinn O'Brien, and at 53, I'd spent more than half my life pouring concrete and raising steel frames into the sky. 15 years as a construction supervisor had left its marked calloused hands, a perpetual squint from years under the sun, and a spine that protested a little more each season. But it was honest work, the kind that let a man sleep at night knowing he'd left something tangible behind. Clara? God, I miss her. 2 years gone, taken by a cancer that moved faster than any of us were prepared for. Some days, the grief still hits like a sucker punch, leaving me winded and lost. That's why I found myself on this impromptu fishing trip, seeking solace in the promise of still waters and the methodical rhythm of casting a line. The idea had come from Mike, my foreman, and the closest thing I had to a friend these days. Quinn, he'd said, clapping me on the shoulder after a particularly rough day on site. You need to get out of your head for a while. I know a spot down in the Appalachians near Fontana Lake. It's so quiet you can hear your own thoughts echo. At first, I brushed him off. The outdoors had always been Clara's thing, not mine. But as the weeks wore on and the walls of my house seemed to close in, the idea took root. Maybe what I needed was a total change of scenery, somewhere I couldn't see her ghost around every corner. So here I was, racing the setting sun as I wound my way through the foothills of western North Carolina. The roads grew narrower, the town sparser, until finally I found myself on a dirt track barely wide enough for the RV. The GPS had given up miles ago, leaving me to navigate by Mike's hand-drawn map and my own questionable sense of direction. As the last rays of sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, I caught my first glimpse of Fontana Lake. The water stretched out before me, a mirror reflecting the fiery sky above. The stillness was almost oppressive after months of city noise. No distant sirens, no hum of traffic, just the whisper of wind through leaves and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. I maneuvered the Winnebago into a small clearing not far from the shore, the tires crunching over fallen leaves and twigs. As I stepped out, the rich scent of damp earth and pine filled my lungs. For the first time in months, I felt the knot in my chest loosen just a fraction. Setting up camp was a welcome distraction. I busied myself with leveling the RV, unfolding the awning, and arranging my fishing gear. By the time I had a small fire crackling in the pit, night had fully fallen. The stars emerged one by one, more than I'd seen in years, until the sky was awash with pinpricks of light. Sitting by the fire, a beer in hand, I found myself talking to Clara as if she were there beside me. "You'd love this place, hun," I murmured, my voice barely audible above the pop and crackle of burning wood. "Maybe you're out there somewhere, seeing it through my eyes." The thought brought a bittersweet smile to my lips. I wasn't a religious man, but the idea that some part of her might still exist, watching over me, was a comfort I clung to on my darkest days. As the fire burned down to embers, exhaustion from the long drive finally caught up with me. I doused the flames, secured the site against any curious wildlife, and retreated to the familiar confines of the Winnebago. Sleep came quickly, dreamless and deep. I woke to birdsong and shafts of early morning sunlight streaming through the RV's windows. For a moment, disoriented, I reached for Clara before reality reasserted itself. The pang of loss was familiar now, a dull ache rather than the sharp agony of those first few months. Shaking off the melancholy, I set about making a simple breakfast of instant coffee and oatmeal. As I ate, I planned out my day fishing in the morning, maybe a short hike in the afternoon to explore the surrounding forest. It was a far cry from the regimented schedule of the construction site, but that was the point, wasn't it? To break away from routine, to find some peace in the solitude. Little did I know as I rigged up my fishing rod and selected a lure, that peace would be the last thing I'd find in these woods. The horrors that awaited me, both natural and unnatural, would push me to the very limits of my endurance and sanity. But in that moment, ignorant of what was to come, I breathed in the crisp morning air and felt, for the first time in too long, a spark of hope. The first day passed uneventfully, almost idyllically. I spent the morning on the lake, my small John boat drifting lazily with the current. The fishing was good. I caught several decent-sized smallmouth bass, more than enough for a hearty lunch. As I cleaned the fish back at camp, I found myself smiling, remembering weekends spent teaching Clara how to fillet our catch. She'd always been squeamish about it, but determined to learn. After lunch, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. The woods were dense, old-growth timber, creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. I marked my path with bright orange surveyor's tape, an old habit from my early days on construction sites. It felt good to be moving, to feel the give of soft earth beneath my boots instead of unyielding concrete. As the afternoon wore on, I began to notice small things that seemed off. Nothing I could put my finger on, just a growing sense of unease that prickled at the back of my neck. The bird calls, which had been a constant backdrop all day, grew less frequent. The underbrush seemed thicker, more tangled, as if actively resisting my passage. I chalked it up to an overactive imagination, too many years in the city making me jumpy in real wilderness. Still, I decided to head back to camp earlier than planned. Better safe than sorry, especially out here where help was hours away at best. That night, as I sat by the fire nursing a beer, the feeling of wrongness intensified. The darkness beyond the circle of firelight seemed deeper, more absolute than it should have been. Twice I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there when I turned to look. I'm not a man given to flights of fancy. Years of managing job sites had beaten any tendency towards the superstitious out of me. But sitting there, with the fire casting flickering shadows and the forest pressing in around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sleep came fitfully that night, punctuated by strange dreams. I woke several times, certain I'd heard something moving outside the RV. Each time I peered out the windows, flashlight in hand, but saw nothing beyond the normal nighttime activity of the forest. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, a fine mist hanging in the air. I went through my morning routine mechanically, trying to shake off the lingering unease from the night before. As I made my way down to the lake, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. There, at the water's edge, were tracks. Not the familiar prints of deer or raccoon, but something larger, with a gait that seemed wrong somehow. The prints were deep, suggesting considerable weight. But the spacing was off for any animal I knew. They led into the water and disappeared. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the tracks and trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A bear, maybe? But no bear I'd ever encountered moved like that. And there was something about the shape of the prints that set my teeth on edge. For the first time since arriving, I seriously considered packing up and leaving. But the rational part of my brain rebelled at the idea. I was a grown man, for Christ's sake, not some kid scared of shadows. Whatever had made those tracks was just an animal, probably more afraid of me than I was of it. Still, as I pushed the boat out onto the lake, I couldn't help but scan the shoreline, half expecting to see something watching me from the treeline. The day passed slowly, the overcast sky making it difficult to gauge the passage of time. I caught nothing, the lake unnaturally still and quiet. It was late afternoon by the time I gave up and headed back to shore. As I secured the boat, I noticed more tracks, fresh ones, leading up from the water and disappearing into the underbrush. My heart rate picked up, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead despite the cool air. I hurried back to camp, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The clearing seemed smaller somehow, the trees looming closer than I remembered. I busied myself with mundane tasks, gathering firewood, checking my supplies, anything to keep my mind occupied and away from wild speculation. As night fell, I found myself jumping at every sound, every shift of shadow. The fire seemed smaller, weaker, barely holding back the encroaching darkness. I kept the shotgun close at hand, telling myself it was just a precaution against bears or mountain lions. But deep down, in a place I didn't want to examine too closely, I knew that whatever was out there in the woods was something far more dangerous than any natural predator. It was just after midnight when I heard it, a low rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. At first I thought it might be distant thunder, but the sky had been clear when I'd turned in for the night. As I lay there in the darkness of the RV, straining my ears, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't any sound I'd ever heard before. It was alive somehow, a deep, resonant growl that I could feel in my chest more than hear. My heart began to race, adrenaline flooding my system as every instinct screamed danger. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, my hand shaking slightly as I fumbled with the switch. The beam cut through the darkness of the RV, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in the corners of my vision. The growl outside intensified, closer now. I could hear something moving through the underbrush, branches snapping under immense weight. Whatever it was big, bigger than any bear I'd ever encountered. I grabbed the shotgun, checking that it was loaded with trembling hands. Part of me wanted to stay put, to hide in the relative safety of the RV, and pray that whatever was out there would lose interest and move on. But a deeper, more primal part of me needed to see, to confront whatever threat was lurking in the darkness. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I eased the RV's door open and stepped outside. The night air was cool against my skin, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something musky and alien. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint flickering light across the clearing. Beyond that small circle of illumination, the forest was a wall of impenetrable darkness. I swept the flashlight beam across the tree line, my grip on the shotgun tightening with each passing second. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a suggestion of movement, a deeper patch of shadow shifting between the trees. But as it emerged into the clearing, I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall at the shoulder. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur. But there was something off about its proportions. The limbs were too long, too fluid in their movements. It moved on all fours, but with an unsettling grace that spoke of barely contained power. But it was the face that truly chilled me to my core. Where there should have been a snout, there was only a flat expanse of leathery skin, broken by a wide, lipless mouth filled with jagged teeth. And the eyes. God, the eyes. They glowed with an unnatural amber light, filled with an intelligence that was anything but animal. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other across the clearing. I could hear my own ragged breathing, see the plumes of vapor in the cool night air. The creature's chest heaved with each breath, a low growl rumbling from deep within its massive frame. And then it charged. I barely had time to react, diving to the side as the creature barreled past me. I felt the rush of air as it missed me by inches, heard the crunch of gravel under its massive paws. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I ran for the RV, not daring to look back. I could hear the creature behind me, its growls now mixed with a high-pitched keening that set my teeth on edge. I reached the door, yanked it open, and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. For a moment all I could do was stand there, gasping for breath, my whole body trembling. Outside I could hear the creature circling the RV, its massive body brushing against the sides. The whole vehicle shook with each impact, and I was sure that at any moment it would find a way in. But it didn't. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the sounds began to fade. The creature's footsteps grew fainter, moving away from the RV and back into the woods. Eventually, silence fell once more, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat there in the dark, shotgun across my lap, jumping at every creak and groan of the forest. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It wasn't possible. Creatures like that didn't exist outside of horror movies and campfire stories. And yet I couldn't deny the evidence of my own eyes. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. Whatever that thing was, it seemed to be nocturnal. I was safe for now, but I knew I couldn't stay. This place, whatever secrets it held, was far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. I needed to get out, to get back to civilization, and what? Tell people about the monster in the woods? Who would believe me? I shook my head, pushing those thoughts aside. Right now, all that mattered was getting out of here alive. I could worry about the rest later. With shaking hands, I began to pack up my gear, constantly glancing out the windows for any sign of movement. The forest was quiet, almost peaceful in the early morning light. But I knew better now. I knew what lurked in the shadows, waiting for nightfall. As I stowed the last of my supplies, a movement at the edge of the clearing caught my eye. I froze, my hand tightening on the shotgun. But it wasn't the creature returning. It was a man. He stood at the tree-line, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in tattered clothes that hung loosely on his frame. His skin was pale, almost gray in the early morning light. And his eyes, there was something wrong with his eyes, a wildness that spoke of madness or something worse. For a long moment, we stared at each other across the clearing. I felt a chill run down my spine, a certainty that this man, whoever he was connected to the horrors I'd experienced. Maybe he was its victim, driven mad by encounters with the creature. Or maybe he was something else entirely. I didn't wait to find out. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and floored the gas. The RV lurched forward, tires spinning in the loose gravel before finding purchase. As I sped out of the clearing, I caught one last glimpse of the man in my rearview mirror. He hadn't moved, his eyes still fixed on me with that unsettling intensity. The drive back to civilization was a blur. I kept expecting to see the creature burst out of the woods, or the strange man appear on the road ahead. But there was nothing, just mile after mile of winding forest road. It wasn't until I reached the small town on the outskirts of the national forest that I finally allowed myself to relax. I pulled into a gas station, my hands shaking as I cut the engine. For a long moment, I just sat there, trying to process everything that had happened. I stumbled out of the RV, my legs weak and unsteady. The bright fluorescent lights of the gas station felt harsh after days in the forest's filtered sunlight. A few early morning customers gave me curious looks as I made my way inside, but I barely noticed them. The young woman behind the counter eyed me warily as I approached. I must have looked a sight unshaven, clothes rumpled, eyes wild with lack of sleep and residual fear. "Coffee," I managed to croak out. "Largest you've got." She nodded, filling a styrofoam cup with steaming black liquid. I cradled it in my hands, savoring the warmth and familiar aroma. It was a small piece of normality, an anchor to the world I knew. As I sipped the coffee, my mind raced. What was I supposed to do now? Go to the police? They'd never believe me. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed myself. The events of the past night felt increasingly surreal in the harsh light of day. I must have been lost in thought longer than I realized, because suddenly the cashier was at my elbow, concern etched on her young face. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need me to call someone?" I blinked, focusing on her. For a moment, I was tempted to spill everything, to unburden myself of the terrifying experiences I'd just been through. But the words died in my throat. How could I possibly explain? "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Just tired from the drive, long night." She nodded, not looking entirely convinced, but stepped back behind the counter. I finished my coffee in silence, trying to decide what to do next. In the end, I decided to head home. I needed time to process, to try and make sense of what had happened. The drive back to Charlotte passed in a blur of highway miles and scattered thoughts. As I pulled into my driveway, the familiar sight of my house brought a wave of relief, so strong it was almost painful. I was home. I was safe. But even as I showered away the grime of the past few days and collapsed into my own bed, I knew that safe was an illusion. The creature I'd seen, the strange man in the woods, they had shattered my understanding of the world. How could I ever feel truly safe again, knowing what lurked in the dark places of the world? The next few weeks passed in a haze. I threw myself back into work, taking on extra hours and projects to keep my mind occupied. But the memories of that night haunted me. I found myself jumping at shadows, scanning the tree line whenever I was outside. I tried to research, spending long nights hunched over my computer, searching for any similar accounts. There were stories, of course, tales of Bigfoot sightings and other cryptids, but nothing that matched what I'd seen. Nothing that explained the wrongness of the creature or the unsettling presence of the man in the woods. As the weeks turned to months, the intensity of the memories began to fade. There were moments when I could almost convince myself it had all been some sort of stress-induced hallucination. Almost. But then I'd catch a glimpse of something moving just out of sight, or wake up in a cold sweat, the echo of that inhuman growl ringing in my ears. And I'd know with bone-deep certainty that it had all been real. I never went back to Fontana Lake. I sold the RV, unable to look at it without remembering that terrifying night. My fishing gear gathered dust in the garage. The thought of being alone in the wilderness, once a source of peace, now filled me with dread. But life, as they say, goes on. Slowly, I began to heal. The nightmares became less frequent, the constant fear fading to a background hum of caution. I found new hobbies, ones that kept me firmly in the realm of civilization. And yet, there's a part of me that can never fully let go. A part that knows the world is bigger, stranger, and far more dangerous than most people realize. Sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself thinking about that clearing in the woods, about the creature and the strange man. And I wonder, are they still out there, lurking in the shadows of Fontana Lake? How many other dark secrets does the world hold, just out of sight of our everyday lives? I don't have answers. I'm not sure I want them. But I know one thing for certain. The next time someone suggests a quiet getaway in the woods, I'll be staying home. Some mysteries I've learned are better left unexplored. It's been 5 years since that night at Fontana Lake. Life has settled into a new normal. I retired from construction work last year, the physical toll of decades on job sites finally catching up with me. These days, I keep busy with volunteer work at the local community center, teaching kids basic carpentry skills. I've never spoken about what happened in those woods. Who would believe me? But sometimes, when I'm working with the kids, I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving where it shouldn't, or a flash of amber in a dark corner. It's gone when I turn to look, of course. Just a trick of the light, I tell myself. But late at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows seem to stretch and move, I wonder. I think about the creature, about the strange man in the woods, and I can't help but feel that somehow, someday, our paths will cross again. Until then, I keep a nightlight burning and a loaded shotgun by my bed just in case. Because once you've seen behind the veil of our everyday world, you can never truly unsee it, and you can never be too careful. After all, who knows what might be lurking in the shadows just beyond the light? I remember my mom used to say that life is a series of calculated risks, and I always thought she was right. I'm Brett McAllister, a guy who has spent most of his life calculating those risks. A mechanical engineer by trade, I've always believed in the reliability of numbers and the precision of machines. But numbers and machines couldn't prepare me for what I encountered in the Oregon wilderness. The fluorescent lights of my office buzzed overhead, a constant reminder of the monotony that had become my life. I stared at the computer screen, my eyes struggling to focus on the endless rows of data before me. The hum of the air conditioning unit provided a sterile backdrop to the rhythmic tapping of keyboards around me. McAllister, a voice called out, breaking my concentration. I looked up to see my supervisor, Dave, standing at the entrance to my cubicle. His face wore its usual expression of mild disapproval. "Yeah," I responded, trying to mask the weariness in my voice. "Those reports need to be on my desk by 5, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And don't forget about the team meeting tomorrow morning. We need to discuss the new project timeline." I nodded, suppressing a sigh. "Got it, Dave. I'll have everything ready." As he walked away, I felt a familiar weight settle on my shoulders. This wasn't the life I had envisioned for myself. Sure, the pay was good and the work was stable, but where was the excitement? The challenge? The sense of purpose? I glanced at the calendar on my desk, my eyes drawn to the circled dates at the end of the week. I had almost forgotten about the vacation days I had requested months ago. A plan began to form in my mind, a chance to break free from the suffocating routine, if only for a few days. That evening, as I finished up the reports and emailed them to Dave, I made a decision. I wasn't going to spend my hard-earned time off sitting at home, watching mindless TV and ordering takeout. No, I needed something more. Something to remind me that there was still adventure to be found in the world. I opened my laptop and began researching camping spots in Oregon. The Tillamook State Forest caught my eye. Vast, rugged, and relatively unknown to me. It was perfect. I could take my RV, spend a few days in the wilderness, and reconnect with the part of myself that had been slowly suffocating under fluorescent lights and endless spreadsheets. As I made my plans, a voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning. It sounded suspiciously like my mother's voice, reminding me of her favorite saying about calculated risks. But I pushed it aside. What risk could there be in a simple camping trip? Little did I know, as I packed my bags and prepared for my journey, that I was about to take the biggest risk of my life, one that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world and myself. The drive to Tillamook State Forest was long but invigorating. As I left the city behind, I could feel the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. The urban sprawl gradually gave way to rolling hills and farmland, and then to the dense green canopy of the forest. I've always loved the solitude of the woods, the way the trees stretch toward the sky like silent sentinels, and the quiet that settles over everything like a comforting blanket. It's peaceful, and peace is hard to come by these days. As I navigated the winding roads leading into the heart of the forest, I felt a sense of anticipation building within me. The forest was dense, a mix of Douglas firs and western hemlocks that towered above me, creating a thick canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The roads were rough and narrow, winding through the hills like a snake, but the drive was worth it. The further I went, the more I felt like I was leaving the worries of my everyday life behind. After a couple of hours of careful driving, I found a small clearing just off a forgotten logging road, tucked away from any potential campers. It was perfect, isolated, quiet, and surrounded by the raw beauty of nature. I maneuvered my RV into position, the tires crunching over fallen leaves and twigs. As I stepped out of the RV, I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, pine-scented air. The forest around me was alive with sound, the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze, the distant call of birds, the soft bubbling of a nearby stream. It was a far cry from the artificial hum of office life. I spent the rest of the day setting up camp and exploring my surroundings. I hiked along barely visible trails, my boots sinking into the soft, mossy ground. The forest was teeming with life, birds flitting between branches, squirrels chattering as they scampered up tree trunks, and once I even caught a glimpse of a deer. Its ears perked up in alert before it bounded away into the undergrowth. As I walked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of insignificance in the face of such ancient, towering trees. Some of these giants had probably been standing here long before I was born, and would likely continue to stand long after I was gone. It was a humbling thought. I took photos as I explored, trying to capture the essence of the forest, the way sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor, the intricate patterns of moss and lichen on tree bark, the delicate beauty of wildflowers peeking out from between fallen logs. By the time I got back to the RV, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath misting in the air. I started a fire in the small pit I had prepared earlier, the flames casting a warm, flickering light across the campsite. I roasted a couple of hot dogs over the fire, their sizzling a pleasant counterpoint to the crackling of the flames. As I sat back in my fold-out chair with a cold beer in hand, I felt a sense of contentment wash over me. This was what I had been missing, this connection to nature, this sense of solitude and peace. As the night deepened, the noises of the forest became more pronounced. The chirping of crickets created a constant background hum, punctuated by the occasional hoot of an owl, or the rustle of some small nocturnal creature in the underbrush. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkness. I leaned back in my chair, gazing up at the sky. Away from the city lights, the stars were incredibly bright, a dazzling array of pinpricks against the velvet blackness of the night sky. I could make out constellations I hadn't seen since I was a kid. Orion's belt, the Big Dipper, Cassiopeia. As I sat there, I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in years. The stress of work, the pressures of everyday life, they all seemed so distant, so insignificant in the face of this vast, ancient forest. I thought about my mother's words about calculated risks, and I smiled to myself. Sometimes the best things in life came from taking a chance, from stepping out of your comfort zone. Little did I know that this sense of peace was about to be shattered, that the forest I found so calming was hiding secrets darker and more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. As I sat there, blissfully unaware, something was stirring in the depths of the woods, something that would change my life forever. I'm not sure when I first noticed that something was off. Maybe it was the way the forest sounds seemed to change, becoming muted and strange. Or perhaps it was a shift in the air, a subtle change in pressure that made my ears pop. Whatever it was, it pulled me out of my peaceful reverie, leaving me with a vague sense of unease. I sat up straighter in my chair, my eyes scanning the treeline. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting long flickering shadows across the clearing. The darkness beyond seemed more intense, more alive somehow. That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong, something I couldn't quite place. It was a low, rumbling noise, like the growl of an engine but deeper, more primal. At first I brushed it off, assuming it was just the wind moving through the trees in a peculiar way. But then I heard it again, closer this time, followed by a series of thuds like something heavy moving through the underbrush. I stood up, my heart rate picking up as I strained to see into the darkness beyond the firelight. My mind raced through the possibilities. Maybe a bear, I thought, or a cougar, something like that. But even as I considered these options, I knew they didn't quite fit. I've been around enough animals to know what they sound like, and this was different. There was an intelligence to it, a deliberateness that sent a shiver down my spine. I grabbed the flashlight from the RV and swept the beam across the edge of the clearing. The trees cast long, flickering shadows, but nothing seemed out of place. Just as I was about to convince myself that my imagination was running wild, I heard the sound again. This time, it was unmistakable. A deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath my feet. And it was close, very close. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Whatever it was watching me. I could feel it. The weight of its gaze was almost palpable, pressing down on me like a physical force. I knew I should go back inside, lock the door, and wait it out. That would have been the sensible thing to do, the safe thing. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe stupidity, or maybe something deeper. A need to confront whatever was out there. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the vast silence of the forest. "Is someone there?" No response. Just the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the faint crackle of the dying fire. I took a step forward, sweeping the flashlight beam in a wide arc. The light caught on something, a flash of movement between the trees. Something large, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for its size. My breath caught in my throat. "Who's there?" I called again, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Show yourself." For a moment, everything was still. Then, without warning, I heard the crashing of branches, followed by a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees. The scream wasn't human, at least not entirely. It had a sharp, almost metallic edge to it, like the grinding of gears. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight in my shock. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Fight or flight instinct kicked in, and I knew I had to make a decision fast. That's when I saw it. In the beam of my flashlight, a massive shape moved between the trees. It was fast, impossibly fast for something so large. I caught only glimpses. A flash of matted fur, the glint of what might have been teeth or claws, eyes that reflected the light like polished metal. My breath caught in my throat as the light fell fully on the creature. It was covered in thick, matted fur, dark and bristling like the quills of a porcupine. But it wasn't the fur that froze me in place. It was the size. This thing was enormous, easily over 8 feet tall, with a hulking muscular frame that rippled with every movement. Its limbs were long and powerful, ending in claws that looked like they could tear through steel. And then I saw its face, or at least what I thought was its face. A grotesque, twisted snout that resembled a wild boar's, with tusks jutting out on either side like jagged knives. But the worst part was its mouth. It was wide, almost impossibly wide, lined with rows of teeth that seemed to glint in the flashlight's beam. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it made sense. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It was like something out of a nightmare, a creature born from the darkest corners of the earth. For a moment we just stared at each other, me, rooted to the spot in terror, and this thing, its chest heaving with each breath, a low growl emanating from its throat. Then, as if a spell had been broken, it moved. It was coming toward me. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I dropped the flashlight and bolted for the RV, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs moving on pure adrenaline. The ground was uneven, and I stumbled more than once, my feet catching on exposed roots and loose rocks. But I didn't dare look back. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush with a terrifying speed that made my blood run cold. The distance to the RV seemed to stretch impossibly. Every step I took felt like I was running through molasses, the vehicle not getting any closer. I could hear my own ragged breathing, feel the burn in my lungs as I pushed myself harder than I ever had before. Behind me, the creature let out another of those blood-curdling screams. It sounded closer now, much closer. I could almost feel its hot breath on the back of my neck. Imagine those razor-sharp claws reaching out for me. I reached the RV, my hands slick with sweat as I fumbled with the door handle. For one heart-stopping moment I thought it was locked, that I had trapped myself out here with this monstrosity. But then the door swung open, and I practically dove inside, slamming it shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I could hear the creature outside, circling the RV, its claws scraping against the metal exterior. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, setting my teeth on edge. Somehow, I managed to start the engine. It roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal, not even bothering to buckle my seatbelt. The RV lurched forward, tires spinning in the loose dirt before finding purchase. I tore down the narrow road, branches scraping against the sides of the vehicle, the steering wheel vibrating in my white-knuckled grip. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the twisting path ahead in brief, terrifying flashes. But the creature wasn't done with me. In the rearview mirror, I saw it burst out of the tree line, its eyes, or whatever they were, glinting in the darkness. It was gaining on me, its massive limbs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. I pushed the RV harder, taking curves at speeds that had the vehicle tilting dangerously. But it wasn't enough. The thing kept coming, relentless, unstoppable. I knew there was no outrunning it, not on this road, not in this vehicle. And then, without warning, it leapt. A massive, impossible leap that carried it over the RV, landing with a thud in front of me. I swerved, barely missing it, but the RV hit a patch of loose gravel and skidded sideways. Time seemed to slow down. I saw the tree rushing towards me, felt the wheel spinning uselessly in my hands. There was a moment of clarity, a strange calm in the eye of the storm, where I thought, so this is how it ends, then impact. The RV crashed into the tree with a sickening crunch of metal and breaking glass. The airbag deployed, slamming into my face with enough force to make me see stars. My head whipped forward, then back, slamming into the headrest. For a moment, everything went black. When I came to, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The engine had cut out, leaving only the hiss of steam escaping from the crumpled hood. My head was throbbing, and I could feel something warm trickling down my forehead. Blood, I realized dimly. I blinked, trying to clear my vision. The windshield was a spiderweb of cracks, and through it, I could see the tree I'd hit, its bark scraped and torn from the impact. But beyond that, nothing. No sign of the creature. For a long moment, I just sat there, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Had I imagined it all? Was it possible that the stress of work, the isolation of the forest, had caused some kind of mental break? But no. The pain in my head, the wreckage of the RV, these were real. And so was what I had seen. Slowly, painfully, I unbuckled my seatbelt and tried to open the driver's side door. It was jammed. I had to climb over to the passenger side, wincing as my battered body protested every movement. As I stumbled out of the RV, the full extent of the damage became clear. The front was crumpled like an accordion, steam still hissing from the ruined engine. It was a miracle I'd survived at all. The forest was silent again, the only sound the crackling of the damaged engine cooling down. I half expected the creature to come charging out of the trees again to finish what it had started, but the forest remained still. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at the wreckage, trying to piece together what had happened. My mind was a fog, the events of the night swirling together in a chaotic blur, but one thing was clear. I couldn't stay there. With shaking hands, I gathered what little I could from the RV, a flashlight, my phone, miraculously unbroken, a bottle of water, and a jacket. Then, casting one last nervous glance at the dark forest around me, I started walking. The road stretched out before me, a ribbon of gravel cutting through the inky blackness of the forest. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I kept the flashlight on, sweeping it from side to side as I walked, though part of me was terrified of what it might reveal. I tried to use my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course not, I thought bitterly, that would be too easy. As I walked, my mind kept replaying the events of the night. The creature I'd seen, it defied explanation. It wasn't a bear, wasn't any animal I'd ever heard of, its size, its speed, the way it moved. It was like something out of a nightmare, but it had been real. I had the bruises and cuts to prove it. I don't know how long I walked, hours probably. The sky began to lighten, the deep black giving way to a murky pre-dawn gray. As the light grew, my fear began to ebb, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw it, a building in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was a small, rundown gas station. It looked like it had seen better days, with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. But at that moment, it was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. I practically stumbled through the door, the bell above it jingling cheerfully, completely at odds with my disheveled and battered appearance. The attendant, an older man with a grizzled beard, looked at me like I was a ghost. His eyes widened as he took in my blood-stained face and torn clothes. "Jesus, son," he said, already reaching for the phone, "what happened to you?" I opened my mouth to tell him, to spill out the whole terrifying story, but as I stood there under the harsh fluorescent lights of the gas station, surrounded by racks of snack foods and coolers of soft drinks, the words wouldn't come. How could I explain what I'd seen? Who would believe me? "Car accident," I managed to croak out. "My RV, it's totaled. Can you call the police?" "I need to report the accident." The attendant nodded, already dialing. As he spoke to the dispatcher, I sank into a plastic chair by the window, my body finally giving in to exhaustion. Through the grimy glass, I could see the forest in the distance. In the light of day, it looked peaceful, even beautiful, but I knew better now. I knew what secrets those trees held. The police arrived about an hour later, 2 officers in a patrol car, looking bored and a little skeptical. I gave them a vague story about swerving to avoid a deer, about losing control of the RV. They bought it, or at least they didn't question me further. "You're lucky to be alive, Mr. McAllister," one of the officers said as he finished taking my statement. "That road can be treacherous, especially at night." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. If only they knew how lucky I really was. They arranged for a tow truck to retrieve the RV and offered to give me a ride to the nearest town where I could rent a car. As we drove away from the gas station, I couldn't help but look back at the forest. In the morning light, it looked so normal, so innocuous, but I knew the truth now. I knew what lurked in its depths. The next few days passed in a blur. I gave a statement to my insurance company, arranged for a rental car, and started the long drive back home. I should have felt relieved to be putting distance between myself and Tillamook State Forest, but instead I felt unsettled. What I had seen that night, it changed everything. The world I thought I knew, the reality I had always taken for granted had been shattered. There were things out there, things that defied explanation, that shouldn't exist but did. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had hit my head harder than I thought in the crash. Maybe the isolation and the darkness had played tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. What I had seen was real. When I finally made it back to my apartment, I spent hours researching. I scoured the internet for any reports of strange sightings in Tillamook State Forest, for any legends or myths that might explain what I had encountered. I found a few vague stories, hikers who had heard strange noises, campers who had felt like they were being watched, but nothing concrete, nothing that came close to what I had experienced. As the days turned into weeks, I tried to return to my normal life. I went back to work, sat through meetings, filled out reports, but everything felt different now. The fluorescent lights of the office seemed harsher, the cubicle walls more confining. The world I had known, the life I had lived, suddenly felt small and insignificant in the face of what I now knew existed. I haven't been back to the Tillamook State Forest since that night. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and the darkness presses in, I hear that sound again, that low, rumbling noise that doesn't belong in this world. And I wonder about what's really out there, hiding in the shadows of our world. I wonder about the things we don't know, the creatures that exist beyond the edges of our understanding. And I wonder if, someday, they'll step out of the shadows and into the light. But mostly, I wonder if I'll be ready when they do. Because one thing is certain, the world is a much stranger and more terrifying place than I ever imagined. And the next time I hear my mom's voice in my head, reminding me that life is a series of calculated risks, I'll remember that some risks can't be calculated, some dangers can't be predicted, and some encounters change you forever. It's been a year since that night in Tillamook State Forest. On the surface, my life has returned to normal. I still go to work every day, still live in the same apartment, still hang out with the same friends. But underneath it all, everything has changed. I've become obsessed with the unknown, with the unexplained. My bookshelves are now filled with tomes on cryptozoology, on folklore and urban legends. I spend my weekends combing through online forums, looking for stories similar to mine, for any hint that others have seen what I saw. I found a few, vague accounts mostly. A hiker in the Pacific Northwest who claims to have seen a creature that matches my description. A group of campers in Northern California who heard strange noises in the night. Nothing concrete, nothing I can prove, but enough to keep me searching. I've thought about going public with my story, about telling the world what I saw. But who would believe me? I'd be labeled a crackpot, a hoaxer. My career would be over, my life as I know it finished. So I keep it to myself, this terrible, wonderful secret. But I can't stay away forever. The forest calls to me, a siren song I can't ignore. I find myself planning another trip, another chance to seek out the truth. I know it's dangerous, know I might not come back. But I have to know, I have to understand. As I pack my bag, checking and double-checking my supplies, I think about my mother's words again. Life is a series of calculated risks. But some risks are worth taking, no matter the cost. Because sometimes the truth is more important than safety. Sometimes the need to know outweighs the fear of what you might find. So I'll go back to Tillamook State Forest. I'll face whatever's waiting for me there. And maybe, just maybe, I'll finally get the answers I'm looking for. Because in the end, that's what it's all about. Not the fear, not the danger, but the search for truth. The quest to understand the world around us, no matter how strange or terrifying it might be. And as I lock my apartment door behind me, ready to embark on this new journey, I can't help but smile. Because for the first time in a long time, I feel alive. Really, truly alive. Whatever happens next, whatever I find in those woods, I know one thing for certain. The adventure is just beginning. It's funny how I ended up here, in the middle of nowhere, doing something I swore I'd never do. You see, I've always been more of a city guy, the kind who enjoys the hum of traffic, the glow of streetlights, and the comfort of knowing a bodega is just around the corner. My name is Arthur Malvin, and I was an investment banker, a workaholic who never took a break until I was forced to. The heart attack wasn't severe, but it was enough to make my doctor insist on time away from the office. So after some soul-searching and pressure from my family, I bought an RV and hit the road, determined to find peace in nature. I figured, why not try camping? Maybe it'd do me some good. That's how I found myself in the deep woods of West Virginia, miles away from anything remotely civilized. The Monongahela National Forest, a name that was hard enough to pronounce, let alone appreciate. The forest was vast, dense, and eerily quiet, with only the sounds of nature to keep me company. At first it was peaceful, almost therapeutic. The air was crisp, the trees were towering, and the sky, when visible through the canopy, was a deep blue I hadn't seen in years. I parked my RV at a secluded spot near a small stream, far enough from the usual campsites to avoid any intrusions. I wanted isolation, and I got it. The first day went by uneventfully. I hiked a bit, read a book, and tried my hand at fishing. Unsuccessfully, of course. As the sun began to set, I made a small fire and cooked some canned beans. It was all very rustic, and I almost enjoyed it. Almost. Night fell quickly in the forest, and with it came a silence so profound that it felt oppressive, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring and your thoughts grow louder. I was just settling into my RV, preparing to call it a night when I heard it. A rustling sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from the trees. At first, I dismissed it as a deer or some other harmless creature. But the sound grew closer, heavier, like something large was moving through the underbrush. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but all I could see were shadows and the occasional glint of light reflecting off leaves. The rustling stopped, and I convinced myself it was nothing. I locked the RV door, checked it twice, and went to bed, feeling a bit silly for being spooked by the wilderness. The next day, I decided to hike a little farther from the campsite, maybe explore some of the less traveled trails. I packed a small bag, filled my water bottle, and set out, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. The trail was barely visible, more of a suggestion than a path, winding through dense trees and over rocky terrain. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was absurd, of course. There was no one out here, no signs of other campers or hikers, just me in the forest. After about an hour of walking, I stumbled upon something odd. A clearing, circular and unnaturally perfect, as if the trees had been cut down deliberately to make space. In the center of the clearing was a stone structure, low to the ground and covered in moss. It looked ancient, like something out of a history book, maybe a forgotten altar or shrine. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached it, noticing strange carvings on the stones, symbols I didn't recognize, etched deeply into the rock. I reached out to touch one, feeling the roughness of the stone under my fingers, when I heard it again. Only this time, it was accompanied by a low, rhythmic thumping, like something heavy was hitting the ground repeatedly. I turned around, expecting to see another hiker, or maybe an animal. But there was nothing. The clearing was empty, save for the trees that encircled it like silent sentinels. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving me standing there, heart pounding, in a clearing that suddenly felt much less inviting. I decided to head back to the RV, quickening my pace, the sense of unease growing with every step. When I returned to the campsite, everything was as I had left it. The fire pit was cold, the RV untouched, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left me. If anything, it had intensified. I spent the rest of the day close to the RV, not wanting to venture out again. As dusk fell, I started a fire, hoping the flames would bring some comfort. They didn't. The night was darker than before, the shadows deeper, and the forest seemed to close in around me. I heard the rustling again, closer this time, and that same thumping noise. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it, but no explanation seemed to fit. I retreated into the RV, locking the door once more and checking all the windows. I had a small hunting knife with me, a last-minute purchase at a roadside shop, and I kept it close, feeling more ridiculous by the minute. But then the RV shook, not a slight tremor but a forceful jolt, as if something had rammed into it. I froze, gripping the knife, waiting for another impact. It came seconds later, harder this time, accompanied by a screeching sound that made my blood run cold. I didn't dare look out the window. I didn't want to see what was out there, but I couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever it was to break in. I had to do something. My mind raced through options, but none of them seemed feasible. Running into the woods was out of the question. I didn't even know what was out there. Staying in the RV felt like a death sentence. The creature, because that's what it had to be, a creature of some kind, was ramming the RV with increasing force, each impact causing the metal to groan and creak. In a burst of adrenaline, I threw open the RV door and bolted out, knife in hand, running in the direction of the clearing. I didn't know why I chose that direction, maybe because it was the only place I knew, or maybe because some instinct told me to go there. The night was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds, and I could barely see where I was going, but I could hear it, the thumping, the rustling, the heavy breathing of whatever was chasing me. I reached the clearing, panting and desperate, and for a moment everything was silent. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your skin crawl. Then from the shadows it emerged. A hulking figure covered in coarse, matted fur, standing on two legs like a man, but with a face that was all wrong. It was like a wolf, but its features were distorted, stretched and twisted into something grotesque. Its eyes, God, those eyes were wide and wild, reflecting the faint light of the moon as it stepped closer. I backed away, heart pounding, knife trembling in my hand. The creature snarled, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the clearing. I knew I couldn't fight it, not with just a knife, but there was nowhere to run. The creature lunged at me, moving with terrifying speed for something so large. I barely had time to react, slashing wildly with the knife as it came at me. The blade connected with something solid, and the creature let out a howl of pain. But it didn't stop. It knocked me to the ground, the force of its attack sending the knife flying out of my hand. I struggled, kicking and punching anything to keep those jaws away from my throat. But it was too strong, its weight pinning me down as it snapped at me, its breath hot and foul against my face. In a last-ditch effort, I reached for a rock, smashing it against the creature's head with all the strength I could muster. It recoiled, stunned, and I took the opportunity to scramble away, grabbing the knife as I went. I don't know what came over me, maybe it was the fear or the desperation, but I turned and charged at the creature, plunging the knife into its side. It let out another howl, thrashing violently, but I held on, driving the blade deeper. Blood, thick and dark, poured from the wound, covering my hands and the ground beneath us. The creature shuddered, its strength waning, and finally collapsed with a final shuddering breath. I stood there, panting, covered in blood, staring at the lifeless body of the creature at my feet. For a moment I couldn't believe it was over, that I had actually survived. The forest was silent again, the oppressive weight of the night lifting slightly. I stumbled back to the RV, knife still in hand, and sat down, my mind numb with shock. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the blood-stained knife. But eventually the sky began to lighten, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees. I didn't feel relief, just an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. I knew I had to leave, to get out of this place before anything else happened. But first, I needed to make sure it was real, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I walked back to the clearing, half expecting the body to be gone, for the creature to have vanished like some nightmare. But it was there, massive and still, its fur matted with blood. In the light of day, it looked less monstrous, but no less terrifying. I knew I couldn't leave it there. I couldn't risk anyone else finding it, or worse, more of its kind coming for it. With trembling hands, I began the gruesome task of burying the creature. It took hours, digging a shallow grave with nothing but a small camping shovel and my bare hands. As I worked, my mind raced with questions. What was this thing? How long had it been out here? Were there more? I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled into something much bigger than I could comprehend. The stone structure in the clearing, the strange symbols, they had to be connected to this creature somehow. But how and why? As I covered the last of the creature with dirt, I made a decision. I couldn't just leave and pretend this never happened. I needed answers. I needed to understand what I had seen, what I had done, but I also knew I couldn't do it alone. I hiked back to my RV, my body aching from the night's ordeal and the morning's labor. I packed up quickly, eager to put some distance between myself and this clearing, but I didn't leave the forest. Instead, I drove to the nearest ranger station, my mind already forming a plan. The ranger on duty, a grizzled man named Frank, looked at me with concern as I stumbled in, still covered in dirt and dried blood. I must have been a sight. I told him I had been attacked by a bear, that I had managed to fight it off but was badly shaken. It wasn't entirely a lie, but I couldn't bring myself to tell the whole truth. Not yet. Frank called in a search party, insisting that they needed to find the bear before it hurt someone else. I led them to the clearing, my heart pounding with each step. But when we arrived, the grave was empty. The disturbed earth was the only evidence that anything had happened there at all. The rangers were confused but not suspicious. They assumed the bear had been wounded but not killed, and had dragged itself away. They set up cameras in the area, and warned me to stay out of the backcountry for a while. I nodded, feigning relief at their help, but inside I was reeling. I didn't leave West Virginia. Instead, I checked into a small motel in the nearest town, determined to find out more about what I had experienced. I spent days in the local library poring over old newspapers, local history books, and folklore collections. I searched for any mention of strange creatures, unexplained disappearances, or unusual stone structures in the forest. At first, I found nothing concrete, just vague legends and campfire stories. But then, buried in a dusty tome of local history, I found something. A photograph from the early 1900s, showing a group of loggers standing around a stone structure that looked eerily similar to the one I had seen in the clearing. The caption mentioned a curious old Indian relic found deep in the forest, but there was something off about the men in the photo. Their smiles seemed forced, their eyes haunted. One man standing at the edge of the group caught my attention. His face was blurred, as if he had moved during the exposure, but there was something about his posture, the way he seemed to be looking over his shoulder, that sent a chill down my spine. I dug deeper, cross-referencing names and dates. I discovered that several of the men in the photo had gone missing in the months following the picture's publication. The official reports cited workplace accidents, but the details were vague, the investigations cursory. As I delved further into the town's history, a pattern began to emerge. Every few decades, there would be a spate of disappearances or unusual animal attacks. The incidents were always explained away: bears, mountain lions, tragic accidents. But the timing was too consistent to be coincidence. I reached out to a professor of anthropology at a nearby university, sharing some of what I had found under the guise of researching local folklore. He seemed intrigued by my questions about the stone structure and the symbols I had seen. "What you're describing," he said over the phone, his voice tinged with excitement, "sounds like it could be connected to some very old, very obscure Native American legends. There are stories of guardian spirits, creatures that protect sacred places, but these weren't always benevolent spirits. Some were said to be changed, corrupted." His words sent a shiver through me. I thanked him for his time and hung up, my mind racing. I was onto something, I was sure of it, but the more I uncovered, the more I realized how dangerous this knowledge could be. Weeks had passed since my encounter in the forest, but I couldn't let it go. The need for answers, for understanding, had become an obsession. I knew I had to go back. I had to see the clearing again, to examine the stone structure more closely. I waited for a clear night when the moon was full. I told myself it was for better visibility, but deep down, I knew it was because I was afraid of what might be lurking in the darkness. I parked my car at the trailhead and set out, my backpack loaded with supplies, flashlights, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and my trusty hunting knife. The forest was different at night. Every shadow seemed to move, every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. But I pressed on, following the faint trail back to the clearing. When I arrived, my breath caught in my throat. The stone structure was still there, but it looked different. In the moonlight, the symbols seemed to shimmer, as if they were alive. I approached cautiously, my flashlight beam dancing over the ancient stones. As I got closer, I realized what had changed. New symbols had been carved into the rock, crude and fresh compared to the weathered originals. With a jolt, I recognized one of them. It was the same shape as the wound I had inflicted on the creature. A twig snapped behind me, and I whirled around, my heart pounding. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood a figure. For a moment, I thought it was the creature again, back from the dead. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was a man, tall and lean, with long, matted hair and wild eyes. He stared at me, not with anger or aggression, but with a kind of desperate intensity. When he spoke, his voice was rough, as if unused to forming words. "You've seen it," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, unable to speak. He took a step forward, and I saw that his clothes were tattered, his skin covered in dirt and old scars. "Then he continued. "You know that it's not over, that it's never over." "What do you mean?" I finally managed to ask. "What is this place? What was that thing?" The man laughed, a hollow, mirthless sound. "Thing? No, not a thing, a guardian, a protector. Or it was once before." He trailed off, his eyes losing focus for a moment before snapping back to me. Before we corrupted it, he finished. I asked, taking a step closer despite my fear. Who are you? What do you know about this? The man sighed, suddenly looking very old and very tired. My name is Robert Carlyle. I was part of a research team that came here decades ago. We thought we'd found something revolutionary, an ancient site of immense power. We were fools. Robert's story poured out of him, as if he'd been waiting years to tell it. His team had discovered the clearing and the stone structure back in the 1980s. They were anthropologists and archaeologists, excited by the prospect of uncovering a previously unknown Native American site. But it was so much more than that, Robert said, his voice trembling. The symbols, the structure, they were a key, a lock, and we, in our arrogance, decided to open it. They had deciphered part of the symbols, enough to perform what they thought was an ancient ritual. But instead of revealing archaeological treasures, their actions had awakened something. The Guardian, as Robert called it, a creature bound to the site for centuries, tasked with protecting it from intruders. It wasn't evil, not at first, Robert explained, but our presence, our meddling, it changed it, corrupted it, and then it started hunting. The story he told chilled me to the bone. The creature had decimated the research team, killing most and driving the rest into hiding or madness. Robert had been the only one to stay, feeling responsible for what they'd unleashed. I've tried to stop it, to undo what we did, he said, gesturing to the new symbols on the stone. But it's not enough. It's never enough. As Robert's tale came to an end, I stood there trying to process everything I'd heard. It seemed impossible, like something out of a nightmare. But I had seen the creature with my own eyes, had fought it with my own hands. What can we do, I asked, surprising myself with the we. But I knew I couldn't walk away from this, not now. Robert looked at me, a glimmer of hope in his tired eyes. There might be a way, he said slowly. The original ritual, we never completed it. We thought we had, but there was a part we missed, a final step. He explained that the ritual was meant to bind the Guardian to its purpose, to renew its connection to the land and its protective role. By interrupting it, they had severed that connection, leaving the creature unmoored and susceptible to corruption. If we could complete the ritual, Robert said, we might be able to restore the Guardian to its original purpose, or at least put it to rest. The plan was dangerous, bordering on insane. We would need to decipher the remaining symbols, gather the necessary components for the ritual, and somehow lure the creature back to the clearing, all while avoiding being killed by the very thing we were trying to save. But what choice did we have? I couldn't leave knowing that this creature was out there, that it might hurt more people. And Robert had been living with this guilt for decades. He deserved a chance to make things right. Over the next few weeks, Robert and I worked tirelessly to prepare for the ritual. We pored over his old notes, cross-referencing them with the books I'd found in the local library. Slowly, painfully, we began to piece together the final parts of the ritual. The components were difficult to gather. Some were simple, specific plants that grew in the forest, water from a particular stream. Others were more challenging, requiring us to dig deep into the earth near the stone structure, searching for buried artifacts. All the while, we were aware of the creature's presence. It never showed itself, but we could feel it watching us. The forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper. More than once, I woke up in my tent, heart pounding, sure that I had heard the sound of heavy breathing just outside. Robert was convinced that the creature was aware of what we were doing. It's afraid, he said one evening as we sat by the campfire. It knows we're trying to change it, and it's afraid. I wasn't sure if that made me feel better or worse. Finally, after what felt like months, but was really only a few weeks, we were ready. We had deciphered the symbols, gathered the components, and steeled ourselves for what was to come. We chose to perform the ritual on the night of the new moon, when the forest would be at its darkest. As we made our way to the clearing, the air felt thick and heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The stone structure seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy as we approached. We laid out our components, drew the necessary symbols on the ground with chalk and ash, and began the ritual. Robert took the lead, chanting words in a language I didn't understand. I followed his cues, adding my voice when needed, placing components in specific patterns around the stone. As the ritual progressed, the air began to change. It crackled with electricity, and I could have sworn I saw faint lights dancing between the trees. And then we heard it, the familiar sound of heavy footsteps drawing closer. The creature burst into the clearing with a roar that shook the trees. It was just as terrifying as I remembered, possibly more so. Its eyes blazed with a mixture of fury and fear as it charged towards us. Robert never faltered in his chanting, even as the creature bore down on us. I wanted to run, every instinct screaming at me to flee, but I held my ground. We were so close. We couldn't stop now. Just as the creature reached the edge of our ritual circle, something changed. The symbols we had drawn began to glow, a soft blue light that quickly intensified. The creature howled, but it sounded less like a roar of rage and more like a cry of pain. I watched in awe as the creature's form began to shift. The matted fur seemed to melt away, revealing something underneath that was both less and more than animal. It was as if I was seeing layers of time peeled back, revealing what the guardian had once been. Robert's chanting reached a crescendo, and suddenly, everything went silent. The glowing symbols flared brightly, then faded. The creature, the guardian, stood motionless in the center of our circle. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then slowly, the guardian turned its gaze to us. The eyes that had once been filled with rage now held something else, understanding, sadness, and perhaps a glimmer of gratitude. With a sound that was part sigh and part growl, the guardian's form began to dissolve. It was like watching mist evaporate in the morning sun. Within moments, it was gone, leaving behind nothing but a feeling of profound emptiness. Robert and I stood in the clearing, breathing heavily, scarcely able to believe what we had just witnessed. The forest around us felt different, lighter somehow, as if a great burden had been lifted. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Robert nodded slowly. "I think so," he said. "We've restored the balance. The guardian is at peace." As dawn broke over the forest, we began the task of clearing away the remnants of the ritual. We worked in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. I knew that I would never be the same after this experience. The world was bigger, stranger, and more dangerous than I had ever imagined. But it was also more wondrous. As we prepared to leave the clearing for the last time, Robert turned to me. "Thank you," he said simply. "I couldn't have done this alone." I nodded, understanding the weight of those words. "What will you do now?" I asked. He looked around the clearing, a small smile on his face. "I think my work here is done," he said. "It's time for me to rejoin the world." As for me, I knew I couldn't go back to my old life. Not completely. The forest had changed me, shown me things I could never unsee. But I didn't regret it. I left the Monongahela National Forest with a newfound respect for the mysteries of the world, and a determination to keep my eyes open to the wonders and dangers that might be lurking just out of sight. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in my rearview mirror. The forest receded behind me, its secrets once again hidden beneath the canopy of ancient trees. But I knew they were there, and I knew that somewhere, in the deepest part of the woods, a guardian rested, its vigil finally complete. The glow of my computer screen was the only light in my cramped studio apartment, casting harsh shadows across the takeout containers and empty energy drink cans littering my desk. It was 2 a.m. on a Friday night or Saturday morning, depending on how you look at it, and I was still hunched over my keyboard, debugging a particularly nasty piece of code. My name is Joel Lasker, and this scene pretty much summed up my life for the past few years. At 32, I was what you'd call a stereotypical city-dwelling software developer. My world revolved around lines of code, deadlines, and the artificial light of various screens. The outdoors? That was something I experienced through nature documentaries when I needed background noise. But something had to give. The breakup with Megan 2 months ago had left me reeling, though I'd never admit it out loud. We'd been together for 3 years, and I thought we were solid. Turns out she needed someone who could actually be present, and not just physically in the room, but mentally in cyberspace. Her words, not mine. Add to that the crushing deadline for this project, a new AI-driven financial analysis tool that was supposed to revolutionize the industry. Or so our CEO kept telling everyone, and I was a tightly wound spring ready to snap. It was during one of my rare moments of introspection, staring blankly at a compiler error message, that I realized I needed a change. Not just a try a new coffee shop kind of change, but something drastic. Something that would force me out of this rut I'd dug myself into. The idea came to me like a bolt of lightning. A camping trip. Not just any camping trip, but one where I'd be completely off the grid. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, no screens. Just me and nature. The thought both terrified and exhilarated me. I spent the next few hours researching options. State parks were too crowded. And besides, I wanted something more authentic. That's when I stumbled upon Black River National Forest. It wasn't one of those famous parks you see on postcards. In fact, I'd never even heard of it before. Tucked away in the northern part of Michigan, it seemed perfect. Remote, largely untouched, and most importantly, no cell service for miles. The next decision was how to do this. Tent camping was out of the question. I wasn't that brave or foolish. An RV seemed like the perfect middle ground. A taste of the outdoors with a semblance of modern comfort. I found a rental place that offered a decent-sized RV at a reservation for the following weekend. The week leading up to the trip was a blur of preparation and last-minute panic. I watched countless YouTube videos on RV basics, how to build a campfire, and what to do if you encounter wildlife. I ordered a ridiculous amount of gear from Amazon. A high-end flashlight, a multi-tool that claimed to have 37 functions, most of which I couldn't even identify. Freeze-dried meals that looked about as appetizing as the protein bars I subsisted on during coding marathons. And a first aid kit that could probably handle minor surgery. As Friday approached, a mix of excitement and anxiety churned in my stomach. Was I really doing this? Me, Joel Lasker, the guy whose idea of roughing it was a hotel without room service? But as I packed my new gear into my beaten-up Prius, I'd pick up the RV on the way. I felt a spark of something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Anticipation. The morning of my departure, I stood in my apartment, looking around at the familiar walls that had been my entire world for so long. My multiple monitors were dark, my high-end gaming rig silent. For the first time in years, I was stepping away from it all, venturing into the unknown. With a deep breath, I shouldered my backpack, picked up my duffel bag, and walked out the door. As I locked up, I couldn't shake the feeling that when I returned, something would be different. I just had no idea how right I was, or how that difference would shake me to my very core. The drive to the RV rental place was surreal. As I navigated through the early morning traffic, the city slowly giving way to suburbs, and then to more open landscapes, I felt like I was driving into another world. The rental process was surprisingly smooth. A brief orientation on how to operate the various systems, a quick rundown of do's and don'ts, and I was handed the keys to what would be my home for the next few days. The RV was smaller than I'd imagined, but still felt enormous compared to my apartment. It was a Class C, the rental guy told me, perfect for beginners. As I climbed into the driver's seat, adjusting mirrors and familiarizing myself with the controls, a wave of doubt washed over me. What was I thinking? I could barely parallel park my Prius, and now I was about to drive this behemoth into the wilderness? But as I pulled out of the lot, something strange happened. The initial terror of maneuvering such a large vehicle gradually gave way to a sense of freedom. I was leaving everything behind, my job, my routines, my comfort zone. For better or worse, I was on an adventure. The GPS guided me north, away from the familiar highways and onto smaller, less traveled roads. The landscape changed dramatically as I drove. Endless fields gave way to rolling hills, which in turn became denser forests. The further north I went, the more isolated I felt. And yet, paradoxically, the more at ease I became. It was late afternoon when I finally reached the outskirts of Black River National Forest. The paved road had long since given way to gravel, and now even that was becoming less maintained. The forest loomed ahead, a wall of green so dark it was almost black in places. As I passed the weathered sign welcoming me to the park, my cell phone gave one last feeble beep before the signal died completely. I was truly alone now, cut off from the digital world that had been my lifeline for so long. The realization should have terrified me, but instead, I felt a strange sense of calm. The constant background hum of notifications, emails, and messages that I hadn't even realized was there suddenly ceased, leaving behind a silence so profound it was almost tangible. Following the rudimentary map I'd been given, actual paper, when was the last time I'd used one of those? I navigated the narrow, winding road deeper into the forest, the trees pressed in close on either side, their branches sometimes scraping against the RV's roof. The light took on a strange quality, filtered through layers of leaves and needles, creating a perpetual twilight, even though it was still hours before sunset. After what felt like hours, but was probably only about 45 minutes, I found the turnoff for the secluded lake I'd picked as my campsite. It wasn't an official campground. Those were too crowded for my taste. This was just a small clearing near the shore, barely visible from the main road, perfect for someone looking to get away from it all. Maneuvering the RV into position was a challenge, but after some creative cursing and a lot of back and forth, I managed to get it parked with a decent view of the lake. As I stepped out, the first thing that hit me was the silence. Not complete silence, There was the rustle of leaves, the occasional bird call, the lapping of water against the shore, but an absence of human-made noise. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, I retreated to the RV. I heated up one of my freeze-dried meals, beef stroganoff that tasted more like salty cardboard, and settled in for the night. The silence outside was more pronounced now, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of some unseen creature in the underbrush. Lying in the RV's small bed, staring up at the ceiling, I found myself both exhilarated and uneasy. I'd come here to escape, to clear my head. But now that I was here, I wasn't sure what to do with myself. The vastness of the forest, the isolation, the unfamiliarity of it all, it was overwhelming. As I drifted off to sleep, my dreams were filled with dark forests and shadowy figures just out of sight. Little did I know, these dreams were just a pale reflection of the reality that awaited me in the coming days. I woke early the next morning, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar surroundings. The RV was filled with a soft, diffuse light filtering through the curtains. As I stumbled to the window and pulled back the fabric, I was greeted by a view that took my breath away. The lake was shrouded in a light mist, the water's surface broken only by the occasional jump of a fish. The forest beyond was a wall of green, the trees standing sentinel-like around the water's edge. It was a scene of such serene beauty that, for a moment, I forgot about my anxieties, my work, everything that had driven me here. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and some truly awful instant coffee, I decided to explore the area around the lake. I'd come here to experience nature, after all, not to hide in the RV armed with my new hiking boots, a backpack filled with water and energy bars, and my trusty multi-tool. Though I still had no idea what half its functions were for, I set out. The ground was soft underfoot, a carpet of pine needles and decaying leaves that muffled my footsteps. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was so different from the recycled air of my apartment that I found myself taking deep breaths, savoring it. As I walked along the lakeshore, I tried to identify the various plants and trees I saw, matching them to the field guide I'd downloaded to my phone before losing signal. It was harder than I'd anticipated. Everything looked so different in real life compared to the neat, carefully photographed images in the guide. I'd been walking for about an hour when I came across something that made me pause. At first, I thought it was just a fallen branch, half buried in the underbrush. But as I got closer, I realized it was a bone, a large one. My first instinct was to recoil, but curiosity got the better of me. I crouched down to examine it more closely. The bone was old, weathered by time and the elements. It was bigger than any animal bone I'd ever seen, easily as long as my forearm. What kind of creature could it have come from? A bear, maybe? But even that didn't seem quite right. The shape was off somehow. As I stood up, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool forest air. For the first time since arriving, I was acutely aware of how alone I was out here, how vulnerable. I scanned the trees around me, half expecting to see eyes staring back. But there was nothing, just the silent, indifferent forest. I hurried back to the RV, my earlier sense of peace replaced by a nagging unease. The bone I'd found seemed to hint at something larger, something that didn't quite fit with the tranquil scene I'd woken up to. But I tried to shake off the feeling. I was letting my imagination run wild, that was all. Too many late-night horror movies and creepypasta stories. Back at the campsite, I busied myself with setting up a fire pit, gathering wood, and generally trying to look like I knew what I was doing. As the day wore on, I found myself repeatedly glancing at the treeline, searching for what? I couldn't say. But the feeling of being watched persisted, growing stronger as the shadows lengthened. That night, as I sat by my carefully constructed and only slightly smoky campfire, I couldn't shake the sense that something had changed. The forest that had seemed so welcoming in the morning light now felt oppressive, full of hidden dangers. The darkness between the trees seemed deeper, more absolute. I stayed up late, feeding the fire and jumping at every snapping twig or rustle in the underbrush. When I finally retreated to the RV, I double-checked the locks, a habit I'd never bothered with in my apartment in the city. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I tried to rationalize my fears. I was just not used to being alone, that was all. Not used to the sounds and rhythms of the forest. But deep down, a part of me knew that wasn't the whole truth. Something had awakened in me out here, some primal instinct that recognized danger. And as I drifted into an uneasy sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had only scratched the surface of what Black River National Forest was hiding. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, the pristine lake now looking more ominous than inviting under the leaden sky. I'd slept fitfully, plagued by dreams of shadowy figures moving just at the edge of my vision, always disappearing when I turned to look directly at them. I woke feeling unrest, my nerves on edge, but I was determined not to let my imagination get the better of me. I'd come out here for a reason, to challenge myself, to step out of my comfort zone. I wasn't going to let some undefined fears send me scurrying back to the safety of my apartment and my screens. After a breakfast that I barely tasted, I decided to push further into the forest. There were no marked trails here, but I had my compass, another impulse purchase that I was now grateful for, and my rudimentary map. I picked a direction that would take me deeper into the woods, away from the lake, and any semblance of civilization. As I walked, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to create a canopy that blocked out much of the already dim light. The ground became more uneven, riddled with exposed roots and hidden dips that threatened to twist an ankle if I wasn't careful. I'd been walking for what felt like hours, though my watch told me it had only been about 90 minutes, when I came across a small clearing. It wasn't much, just a break in the endless sea of trees, but it was enough to make me pause. Something about it felt off. The grass in the clearing was flattened in places, as if something large had recently passed through. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just another fallen tree, its trunk unusually thick and twisted. But as I approached, my brain struggling to make sense of what I was seeing, I realized it was something else entirely. The thing was massive, easily 20 feet long from what I assumed was its head to the tip of its tail. It was covered in thick, matted fur that was almost black, with patches of a deep, rusty brown that I belatedly realized was dried blood. Its body was twisted, broken in places, as if it had been in some titanic struggle before finally succumbing. I stood there, frozen, my mind reeling as it tried to categorize what I was seeing. It was like nothing I'd ever encountered before, either in real life or in any nature documentary I'd ever watched. The closest comparison I could make was to a grizzly bear, but even that didn't seem right. This creature was larger, more muscular, with claws as long as my forearm and teeth that looked like they could crush bone with ease. But what really unsettled me were the deep gouges along its sides. These weren't the marks of any natural predator I knew of. They looked like something even bigger, even more terrifying, had ripped into this beast. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this thing as possible. But a morbid curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. I found myself taking a hesitant step forward, then another. The smell hit me then, a rank, putrid odor of decay that made my stomach churn. But underneath that was something else, a musky, animal scent that seemed to awaken something primal in my brain. I was close enough now to see details I wished I hadn't noticed. The creature's eyes, glazed over in death, were unnaturally large, with vertical pupils like a cat's. Its jaw was distended, as if it had been trying to roar one last time before whatever killed it had finished the job. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't quite a growl, not quite a roar, but something in between that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't stick around to investigate further. My curiosity evaporated in an instant, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. I turned and ran, no longer caring about direction or getting lost. All that mattered was putting as much distance between myself and that clearing as possible. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. I ran until my lungs burned, and my legs felt like jelly. Only then did I slow down, bent over with my hands on my knees, gulping in great lungfuls of air. As my panic subsided, I realized I had no idea where I was. The forest looked the same in every direction, endless trees stretching as far as I could see. I fumbled for my compass with shaking hands, trying to orient myself. It took me hours to find my way back to the campsite. The forest seemed different now, more oppressive. The once quiet woods were filled with unfamiliar sounds that set my nerves on edge. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump, convinced that some monstrous creature was about to leap out at me. When I finally stumbled out of the tree line and saw my RV, I nearly wept with relief. I was drenched in sweat, my clothes torn and dirty, scratches on my arms and face from my headlong flight through the forest. I locked myself in the RV, drawing all the curtains and double-checking every window. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It couldn't be real, could it? Maybe I was suffering from some kind of hallucination brought on by stress, lack of sleep, and unfamiliar surroundings. Yes, that had to be it. There was no way that creature could actually exist. But even as I tried to rationalize it away, I knew deep down that what I'd seen was real. And worse, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had killed that creature might still be out there. As night fell, the forest around the lake became eerily quiet, as if the entire area was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone, that something was out there watching, waiting. I forced myself to go through my evening routine, heating up another freeze-dried meal that I barely tasted, but I couldn't relax. Even as I sat by the fire, I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, scanning the dark tree line for any sign of movement. The flames, which had seemed so comforting the night before, now cast dancing shadows that my overstimulated imagination turned into lurking monsters. And then I heard it, a distant echoing roar that sent a shiver down my spine. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. It was deeper, more guttural, resonating through the trees like the rumble of thunder. I froze, listening intently, but the sound didn't come again. That was enough to send me scrambling into the RV, locking the door behind me. I knew the thin metal walls were a flimsy shield against whatever was out there, but it was all I had. I checked the windows, pulled the curtains tight, sat in the driver's seat, my eyes glued to the darkness outside. Hours passed, but nothing happened. The forest remained silent, the only sound the occasional crackle of the dying fire outside. Eventually exhaustion got the better of me, and I drifted off into an uneasy sleep. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. For a moment I couldn't remember where I was or what had woken me. Then I heard it, something heavy moving around the RV, its weight causing the vehicle to sway slightly. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen. Whatever it was big, bigger than any animal I'd ever encountered. The RV shook again, this time more violently, as if something was pushing against it, testing its strength. I wanted to believe it was just a bear, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I could feel the same dread from earlier creeping back, wrapping around my chest like a vice. I fumbled in the dark for the kitchen knife I'd left on the counter, clutching it in my trembling hand. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was better than nothing. The creature outside let out a low rumbling noise, almost like a growl but deeper, more resonant. It shook the very air around me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence looming just outside, separated from me by nothing but a few inches of metal and glass. The next few minutes felt like hours. The RV continued to shake, the creature circling it slowly, methodically, as if it was toying with me, deciding how best to get inside. I could hear its breath now, heavy and ragged, punctuated by occasional snorts and growls. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The RV went still, the air inside thick with tension. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. I sat there, knife clutched to my chest, ears straining for any sound of the creature's return. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my eyes fixed on the darkness outside, waiting for the creature to return. But it never did. When dawn finally broke, I could see the faint outline of its massive footprints in the dirt around the RV, deep and clawed, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. I didn't waste any time. As soon as the first light of day touched the trees, I was in motion. I didn't bother with breakfast or cleaning up the campsite. All I could think about was getting out of there as fast as possible. My hands shook as I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtering a few times before roaring to life. I threw it into reverse, not caring about the chairs and other camping equipment I was leaving behind. They didn't matter. Nothing mattered except putting as much distance between myself and Black River as I could. I drove faster than I probably should have on those narrow, winding roads, the RV swaying dangerously on the curves. Every shadow between the trees looked like a lurking monster. Every sound over the rumble of the engine made me flinch. It wasn't until I reached the main road, the forest thinning out around me, that I finally began to relax. My grip on the steering wheel loosened, my breathing slowed. I was safe. I had made it out. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, a small place called Millbrook. I pulled into a crowded gas station, parked the RV, and finally allowed myself to breathe. The normality of it all, people going about their day, cars pulling in and out, the hum of civilization, was almost shocking after the terror of the night before. As I sat there trying to gather my thoughts, an older man approached the RV. He had the weathered look of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors, his face creased and tanned. "You all right there, son?" he asked, peering at me through the window. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I don't know what made me do it, but I found myself spilling out the whole story. The creature I'd found in the forest, the terrifying night, all of it. I expected him to laugh, to tell me I was crazy, or that I'd had some kind of vivid nightmare. But he didn't. He just nodded, his expression grim. "The beast of Black River," he said, his voice low. "Been stories about it for generations. Some say it's a giant wolf, others a demon from the depths of the forest. Whatever it is, you're lucky to have made it out alive." I stared at him, a chill running down my spine. You believe me?" He shrugged. "Folks around here know better than to dismiss the stories. The forest keeps its secrets, but sometimes it gives us a glimpse of things we ain't meant to understand." I sat there for a long time after he left, mulling over his words. Part of me wanted to dig deeper, to uncover the truth behind the beast of Black River. But a larger part, the part that still trembled at the memory of that terrible night, knew that some secrets were better left buried. I returned the RV that afternoon, making up a story about a family emergency cutting my trip short. The rental guy seemed skeptical, but didn't push it. As I drove my own car back to the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something far worse than I could ever understand. Black River had taken something from me, a sense of safety, of surety about the world and my place in it. But it had given me something too, a newfound appreciation for the comforts of civilization, for the safety of my small, predictable life. As I pulled into my apartment complex, the familiar skyline of the city rising before me, I felt a profound sense of relief. I was home. I was safe. But even as I settled back into my routine, the glow of my computer screen, the hum of the city outside my window, I knew I'd never truly be the same. The memory of those footprints in the dirt, of that bone-chilling roar in the night, would stay with me forever. And sometimes, in the deep of night when the city sleeps and the shadows grow long, I find myself listening. Listening for a sound I hope never to hear again. The sound of something ancient and terrible, something that lurks in the dark places of the world, waiting. The beast of Black River may be far away, but its shadow will always be with me. And I know now, with a certainty that chills me to my core, that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. Things that remind us that for all our technology, all our progress, we are still small creatures in a vast and mysterious wilderness. I went to Black River to find myself. Instead, I found a terror that will haunt me for the rest of my days. But I also found a strength I didn't know I had, a will to survive that pulled me through when all seemed lost. So if you ever find yourself drawn to the wild places, to the dark and untamed corners of the world, remember my story. Remember that sometimes the greatest horrors are not in what we see, but in what remains hidden, waiting in the shadows. And sometimes the greatest victory is simply in surviving to tell the tale. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to believe in monsters. After 10 years as an emergency room nurse at St. Alphonsus Regional Medical Center in Boise, I thought I'd seen it all. Gunshot wounds, car crash victims, overdoses, the worst of humanity's frailties paraded before me on a nightly basis. My name is Alden Gable, and I've always prided myself on being a rational, level-headed guy. But what happened to me in the Clearwater National Forest shook my beliefs to the core and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. It was the summer of 2023, and I'd been feeling the weight of my job more than ever. The past few years had been brutal, with the pandemic stretching our resources to the breaking point. Even as things slowly returned to normal, the toll on healthcare workers like myself was immense. I'd watched colleagues burn out, some leaving the profession altogether. I was determined not to be one of them, but I knew I needed a break, a real one, away from the constant beeping of machines and the smell of antiseptic. That's when I decided to take a month off and go camping. Not just any camping, mind you. I wanted complete isolation, a chance to decompress and reconnect with nature. I'd always been drawn to solitude, finding peace in quiet moments between the chaos of the ER. So I rented an RV, packed it with supplies, and set my sights on the remote wilderness of northern Idaho. As I left Boise behind, driving north on Highway 55, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. The cityscape gradually gave way to rolling hills, then to the rugged mountains of the Payette National Forest. I stopped for lunch in the small town of McCall, sitting by the serene waters of Payette Lake. It was there, over a plate of fresh trout at a local diner, that I overheard a conversation that should have been my first warning. Two older men, weathered faces suggesting years of outdoor living, were talking in hushed tones about something they'd seen deep in the Clearwater Forest. "It wasn't no bear, Tom," one of them insisted, his voice a gravelly whisper. Bears don't move like that, and they sure as hell don't stand that tall. His companion shushed him, glancing around nervously before replying, "Keep your voice down, Bill. You know how people talk. We don't need another round of hunters coming up here chasing shadows." I should have paid more attention, should have asked them what they meant, but I was too focused on my own need for escape, too certain in my disbelief of anything supernatural. I chalked it up to local folklore, the kind of stories small towns thrive on to attract tourists and add a bit of mystery to their surroundings. As I continued north, the roads became narrower, the towns fewer and farther between. By late afternoon, I was deep in the Clearwater National Forest, following a winding logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The RV groaned as it navigated the rough terrain, but I pressed on, determined to find the perfect spot, far from any hint of civilization. Just as the sun was beginning to dip below the treeline, I found it. A small clearing, barely visible from the overgrown road, beckoned me. I carefully maneuvered the RV into the space, the vehicle's bulk barely fitting between the towering pines. As I stepped out, the scent of pine and damp earth filled my nostrils. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects, a symphony of nature that instantly soothed my frayed nerves. I took a deep breath, savoring the clean, crisp air. This was exactly what I needed. No cell service, no people. Just me and the great outdoors. As I began to set up camp, I felt the last vestiges of stress from my job melting away. I was ready for peace, for quiet contemplation. I had no idea that in just a few short days, this idyllic forest would become the setting for the most terrifying experience of my life. If I had known what was waiting for me in the depths of the Clearwater Forest, I would have turned that RV around and never looked back. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20ths, and I was about to learn that some things are better left undiscovered. The first night passed uneventfully. I slept better than I had in months, lulled by the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant hooting of an owl. When I awoke, sunlight was filtering through the RV's windows, casting dappled shadows across the interior. I stepped outside, stretching as I surveyed my surroundings in the morning light. The clearing was smaller than I'd realized, maybe 30 feet across at its widest point. Dense undergrowth ringed the area, giving way to towering pines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and something else, a faint earthy smell I couldn't quite place. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and strong coffee, I decided to explore the immediate area around my campsite. I grabbed my backpack, stuffing it with water, some trail mix, and a basic first aid kit. Old habits from the ER die hard. As an afterthought, I tossed in the small hunting knife I'd brought along. I'd never been much for hunting, but something about the vastness of the forest made me feel I should have some form of protection. The forest floor was a thick carpet of pine needles, muffling my footsteps as I ventured away from the clearing. I hadn't gone far when I came across a small stream, its clear water bubbling over smooth stones. It was picturesque, like something out of a nature documentary. I paused to refill my water bottle, marveling at how clean and fresh the water looked compared to what came out of my tap back in Boise. As I crouched by the stream, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Across the water, partially hidden by a fallen log, was a deer. It was a young buck, its antlers still small and velvety. For a moment we stared at each other, neither moving. Then suddenly its ears pricked up. It turned its head sharply, looking deeper into the forest, before bounding away with surprising speed. I stood up, peering in the direction the deer had looked, but saw nothing unusual. Still, a shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had spooked the animal, something it perceived as a threat. Shaking off the unease, I continued my exploration. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals. I even spotted a red fox darting between the trees, its russet coat a bright splash of color against the greens and browns of the forest. As midday approached, I found myself back at the campsite. The physical exertion and fresh air had worked up my appetite, so I set about making lunch. I'd brought a small portable grill, and soon the smell of grilling sausages filled the air. As I ate, I pored over a map of the area I'd brought with me. My finger traced the faint lines marking old logging roads and trails. One spot, marked simply as Old Clearwater, caught my attention. It was maybe a 3-hour hike from my location, an abandoned logging camp according to the map's legend. Something about it intrigued me. Perhaps it was the nurse in me, always drawn to places where human activity had left its mark. I decided that would be my destination for tomorrow's hike. A visit to this remnant of the area's logging history seemed like a perfect way to connect with the forest's past. If only I had known then what awaited me there, I might have made a very different choice. The rest of the day passed peacefully. I read for a while, losing myself in a thriller I'd brought along. As evening fell, I built a small fire, watching as the flames cast dancing shadows across the clearing. The night was clear, and as true darkness fell, the sky came alive with stars. Away from the city's light pollution, the Milky Way stretched across the heavens in a brilliant band. I stayed up late, mesmerized by the fire and the stars, feeling more at peace than I had in years. When I finally turned in, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning dawned bright and clear. I woke early, excited about my planned hike to Old Clearwater. I packed my backpack carefully, extra water, high-energy snacks, a basic first aid kit, my hunting knife, and a flashlight. I also threw in a small camera, hoping to document anything interesting I might find at the old logging camp. As I set out, the forest seemed different somehow. The bird song that had been so prevalent the day before was noticeably subdued. I chalked it up to the time of day, figuring the wildlife might be less active in the increasing heat. The hike started easily enough. I followed an overgrown trail that I assumed was an old logging road, but as I ventured deeper into the forest, the path became less distinct. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to create a dense canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. About an hour into my hike, I noticed something odd. The forest had gone almost completely silent. No birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the insects seemed to have gone quiet. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves under my feet. I paused, suddenly aware of how alone I was out here. For the first time since arriving, I felt a twinge of unease. I thought about turning back, but my curiosity about Old Clearwater won out. I pressed on, trying to shake off the growing sense of discomfort. As I hiked, the forest continued to change. The trees became older, their trunks wider and gnarled with age. The underbrush grew thicker, as if nature was reclaiming this part of the forest with particular vigor. I had to push through dense ferns and navigate around fallen logs, my progress slowing considerably. It was then that I first felt it, a sensation of being watched. I stopped, scanning the forest around me, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just trees and shadows. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on me, following my every move. I quickened my pace, suddenly eager to reach Old Clearwater. At least there, I thought, I'd be in a clearing where I could see my surroundings better. I checked my map again, relieved to see that I should be nearing the old camp. As I pushed through a particularly dense patch of undergrowth, I suddenly found myself on the edge of a large clearing. I had reached Old Clearwater, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to discover. The clearing that had once been the Old Clearwater logging camp sprawled before me, a jarring contrast to the dense forest I'd just emerged from. Sunlight streamed down unobstructed, illuminating a scene that seemed frozen in time. Rusted machinery lay scattered about, half swallowed by encroaching vegetation. I recognized an old sawmill, its blade dulled by decades of exposure to the elements. Nearby, the skeletal remains of what must have been the main lodge sagged forlornly, its roof partially caved in. Several smaller cabins in various states of decay ringed the clearing, their windows dark and empty. As I stepped further into the camp, the crunch of gravel under my feet seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. Not even the wind stirred. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I approached one of the better-preserved cabins, its door hanging askew on rusted hinges. Peering inside, I saw overturned furniture, moldering books, and what looked like claw marks scoring the walls. My pulse quickened. Those marks were far too large to have been made by any normal forest predator. Moving on, I noticed something odd about the plant life reclaiming the camp. The vegetation seemed wrong somehow. The ferns were larger than any I'd ever seen, their fronds an unusually deep shade of green. Vines as thick as my arm snaked up the sides of buildings and across the ground, their leaves bearing an iridescent sheen I'd never encountered before. As I examined a particularly strange-looking plant, my boot struck something solid. Looking down, I realized I'd stumbled upon a small metallic container, half buried in the soil. Curiosity overcame caution, and I knelt to unearth it. The box was about the size of a shoebox, made of a dull metal that didn't seem to have corroded despite years of exposure. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, unlike any language I recognized. With some effort, I managed to pry the lid open. Inside, I found a stack of papers, remarkably well preserved. They appeared to be a mix of scientific notes and personal journal entries. As I skimmed the pages, certain phrases jumped out at me. The specimen continues to grow at an alarming rate. Effects on local flora and fauna, far beyond our initial projections. Harris disappeared into the forest 3 days ago. The screams we heard last night, God help us all. My hands shook as I read, a cold dread settling in the pit of my stomach. Whatever had happened here, whatever these people had been involved with, it was clear things had gone horribly wrong. A sudden sound snapped me back to the present, a low guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I shot to my feet, the papers falling from my hands as I scanned the clearing frantically. There, at the edge of the camp, half hidden in the shadows of the forest, I saw it. A massive shape, easily 8 feet tall, its body a nightmarish fusion of fur, scales, and what looked unsettlingly like human features. Its eyes, too intelligent to belong to any animal, fixed on me with predatory focus. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other. Then, with horrifying speed, it moved. I caught a glimpse of claws and teeth before my survival instinct kicked in. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, all thoughts of following the trail abandoned in my panic. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't dare slow down. Behind me, I could hear it pursuing, an impossible combination of speed and size crashing through the forest. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. I had no idea if I was even heading in the right direction. My only goal to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. Just as I felt my strength beginning to fail, I burst out of the tree-line and into my campsite. Without breaking stride, I sprinted for the RV, fumbling with the keys as I reached the door. I could hear it getting closer, the sound of its pursuit growing louder. I practically fell into the RV, slamming the door behind me and locking it with shaking hands. For several agonizing moments, I waited, certain that at any second the creature would tear through the thin walls of the vehicle. But the attack never came. Gradually, the sounds of pursuit faded, replaced by an eerie silence. I remained frozen in place, barely daring to breathe, straining my ears for any sign of the creature's presence. Hours seemed to pass, though my watch told me it had only been about 45 minutes. Slowly, cautiously, I peered out the window. The clearing appeared empty, peaceful even in the late afternoon sun. But I knew better now. I knew what was out there, hiding in the shadows of the forest. As the adrenaline began to wear off, my mind raced. What was that thing? How was it connected to the strange documents I'd found? And most pressingly, how was I going to get out of here alive? I knew I couldn't stay in the RV forever. But the thought of stepping outside, of making the long drive back down that lonely logging road with that creature possibly lurking in the woods, filled me with dread. As night began to fall, I sat in the gathering darkness of the RV, the hunting knife clutched in my white-knuckled grip, and tried to figure out my next move. One thing was certain. The peaceful retreat I had planned had turned into a desperate fight for survival, and I had a sinking feeling that my ordeal was far from over. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds that just days ago I would have found soothing. Now, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of fear through me. I sat in the RV, all lights off, straining my eyes to peer into the impenetrable blackness outside. The hours crawled by. I didn't dare sleep, couldn't even if I wanted to. My mind kept replaying the image of that creature, its impossible form, those two intelligent eyes. I found myself analyzing every detail, my scientific mind trying to make sense of something that defied explanation. Around midnight, a new sound cut through the nocturnal chorus. A low, keening wail that raised the hair on the back of my neck. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, carrying notes of both bestial rage and human anguish. The sound grew closer, circling the campsite. I clutched the hunting knife tighter, knowing full well how pitiful a defense it would be if that thing decided to attack. A sudden thud against the side of the RV nearly stopped my heart. Something was out there, testing the walls of my shelter. I could hear it moving around the vehicle, its breathing heavy and ragged. Then came a new sound, the slow, deliberate scrape of claws against metal. I held my breath, eyes squeezed shut, silently praying for it to leave. The scraping continued, punctuated by occasional thuds as the creature pushed against the RV. I could feel the vehicle rocking slightly with each impact. Just when I thought the walls would give way, the assault stopped. The forest fell silent again, but I didn't dare move. I remained frozen in place, listening intently for any sign of the creature's presence. Dawn found me still clutching the knife, my muscles aching from tension. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. I hadn't slept a wink, but adrenaline and fear kept me alert. I knew I couldn't stay here. Whatever that thing was, it knew where I was, and I doubted the RV would withstand another night of its attentions. I had to leave, to make a run for it, while I had daylight on my side. With shaking hands, I gathered what supplies I could into my backpack. Water, energy bars, the hunting knife, and a first aid kit. I also grabbed the mysterious documents I'd found at Old Clearwater, stuffing them into a waterproof bag. Something told me they were important, that they might hold clues to what was happening in this forest. Taking a deep breath, I cracked open the RV door. The morning air was crisp and clean, belying the horrors of the night. I scanned the clearing, looking for any sign of the creature. Seeing nothing, I stepped out, my legs trembling slightly as I made my way to the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, sounding impossibly loud in the quiet forest. I threw the RV into reverse, maneuvering carefully to turn around on the narrow logging road. As I shifted into drive, a movement at the edge of the clearing caught my eye. There it was, partially hidden behind a massive pine. Even in the daylight, its form seemed to shift and waver, as if my eyes couldn't quite focus on it. But those eyes, those I could see clearly, they bored into me, filled with a terrible intelligence and something else. Was that hunger? I slammed on the accelerator, the RV lurching forward down the rough road. In the rearview mirror, I saw the creature emerge fully from the tree-line. It stood there, watching me flee, making no move to pursue. Somehow, that was even more terrifying than if it had given chase. The drive back was a nightmare. Every bend in the road held the potential for an ambush. Every shadow might have concealed that monstrous form. The RV rattled and shook as I pushed it to its limits, far faster than was safe on the deteriorated logging road. After what felt like an eternity, I burst out onto the main highway. The sight of other cars, of normal, everyday traffic, nearly brought me to tears. I didn't slow down until I reached the outskirts of the nearest town, a small logging community called Orofino. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn off the engine. As the adrenaline began to wear off, the full weight of what I'd experienced crashed down on me. I sat there, staring blankly at the steering wheel, trying to process it all. A knock on the window startled me out of my daze. An older man in a sheriff's uniform peered in at me, concern etched on his weathered face. "You all right there, son?" he asked as I rolled down the window. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I opened my mouth to respond, to pour out the whole terrifying story, but hesitated. How could I explain what I'd seen? Who would believe me? The sheriff? Clyde, according to his nameplate, must have sensed my distress. "Why don't you come on down to the station?" he suggested gently. "Looks like you could use a strong cup of coffee, and maybe someone to talk to." As I followed Clyde to the sheriff's station, my mind raced. Should I tell him everything? Would he dismiss me as some crazy city dweller spooked by the woods? Or worse, would he believe me? Because if what I saw was real, if that thing was still out there in the Clearwater forest, then this quiet little town might be in terrible danger. And what about those documents? What secrets did they hold about the origins of that creature? As I stepped into the sheriff's station, I realized my ordeal was far from over. In fact, it might have only just begun. Sheriff Clyde's office was a throwback to another era, all wood paneling and the lingering scent of cigarette smoke. As I sank into a worn leather chair, clutching a mug of strong black coffee, I found myself pouring out the whole story. To his credit, Clyde listened without interruption, his expression grave. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, a long sigh escaping him. "I wish I could say you were the first to come in here with a story like that," he said finally. "Truth is, we've been hearing whispers about something in those woods for years. Most folks write it off as campfire tales or the ramblings of overstressed loggers. But a few years back, we had a whole team of geologists go missing up there. Never did find out what happened to them." My blood ran cold at his words. "So you believe me?" I asked, hardly daring to hope. Clyde nodded slowly. "I've known these forests my whole life, son. There are things out there that defy explanation. But this," he gestured to the documents I'd brought from Old Clearwater, which lay spread out on his desk. "This is something else entirely." Over the next few hours, we pored over the papers together. They painted a disturbing picture. Decades ago, a secret government project had set up shop in Old Clearwater under the guise of a logging operation. They were experimenting with some kind of biological agent, something that could accelerate evolution. But it had gotten out of control, mutating the local flora and fauna in unpredictable ways. The final entries were frantic, describing the emergence of a creature that embodied their worst fears, a perfect predator, highly intelligent and constantly evolving. The project was abandoned in a hurry, the site sealed off, and the incident buried under layers of bureaucracy and denial. As night fell, Clyde made some calls. By morning, a team of government officials had descended on Orofino. Men in dark suits questioned me for hours, going over every detail of my encounter. They were particularly interested in the documents I'd found. In the days that followed, the Clearwater National Forest was closed off to the public, citing an ecological crisis. Military vehicles rolled through town, heading up into the mountains. We heard distant explosions, saw plumes of smoke rising above the tree line. A week later, it was over. The officials packed up and left as quickly as they'd come. The forest was reopened, with warnings about lingering environmental hazards. Life in Orofino seemed to return to normal. But I knew better. In the dark of night, I could still hear that keening wail echoing in my dreams. And sometimes, when I looked to the mountains, I could swear I saw a shape moving among the trees, always just at the edge of perception. I never returned to my job in Boise. Instead, I took up Clyde's offer to stay on in Orofino, working as a nurse at the local clinic. In my free time, I researched similar incidents around the world, gathering evidence of other experiments gone wrong, other creatures lurking in the shadows of our world. Because I know the truth now. What I saw in those woods wasn't destroyed, wasn't contained. It's still out there, evolving, waiting. And someday, it or something like it will emerge again. When it does, someone needs to be ready. Someone needs to remember the thing in Clearwater Forest. As for me, I found a strange sort of peace here, on the edge of the wilderness. Every rustle of leaves, every unexplained sound in the night reminds me that the world is far more mysterious and terrifying than we ever imagined. But it also reminds me that I survived, that I faced the unknown and lived to tell the tale. So I watch and I wait and I remember. Because, in the end, that's all any of us can do in the face of the inexplicable, bear witness, and hope that when the time comes, we'll find the strength to face our fears once again. My name is Amos Wainwright, and the events I'm about to recount happened to me in 2012. Even now, years later, I find myself hesitating as I put pen to paper. The memories are still raw, the fear still palpable. But I need to tell this story, if only to make sense of it all, and perhaps in some small way to warn others. I've been a police officer in Mendocino, California, for over 2 decades. It's a small coastal town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business. Most days, the biggest excitement we see is a tourist getting a little too rowdy at one of the local wineries, or maybe a domestic dispute that needs cooling down. It's a beautiful place, really. The rugged coastline, the towering redwoods, the rolling vineyards. It's postcard perfect. But like anywhere else, Mendocino has its secrets, dark corners that most folks prefer to ignore. I've got a good life here. My wife Janice teaches at the local elementary school. We've got 2 kids, Theo, who's just started high school, and Lucy, our little firecracker in middle school. We live in a modest house on Pallet Drive, with a view of the ocean on clear days. It's the kind of life I always wanted, steady and predictable. Or at least it was. It all started on a Tuesday in late September. The tourist season was winding down, and there was a chill in the air that hinted at the coming fall. I remember that morning clearly. Janice was making pancakes, the kids were arguing over who got the last of the orange juice, and I was sipping my coffee skimming through the local paper. Just another normal day. I kissed Janice goodbye, ruffled the kids' hair, and headed out to my patrol car. The drive to the station was uneventful, the familiar scenery of Mendocino sliding by my window. Little did I know that this ordinary morning would be the last moment of normalcy I'd experience for a long time. The station was quiet when I arrived. Mary, our dispatcher, was at her desk, idly flipping through a magazine. My partner, Felix Rodriguez, was already there, his feet propped up on his desk as he tossed a stress ball from hand to hand. "Morning, Amos," Felix called out as I walked in. "Ready for another thrilling day of keeping the peace in our little slice of paradise?" I chuckled, hanging up my jacket. "You never know, Felix. Today might be the day we finally crack that case of Mrs. Henderson's missing garden gnomes." We shared a laugh, but there was an undercurrent of restlessness in Felix's voice. He was a good cop, sharp and dedicated. But at 28, He was still itching for more action than Mendocino usually provided. I understood. I'd been the same way when I first joined the force, but 2 decades on the job had taught me to appreciate the quiet days. I just settled in at my desk, ready to tackle the mountain of paperwork that seems to be the real job of small-town cops, when Mary's voice crackled over the intercom. "Amos, Felix, we've got a situation. 2 hikers reported missing up near the old Kelsey mine. Their friends just called it in." Felix was on his feet in an instant, a gleam in his eye. "Finally, some real action. Let's roll, Amos." I nodded, grabbing my jacket and gear. As we headed out to the patrol car, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. The Kelsey mine had been abandoned for decades, and it had a reputation. Local kids dared each other to spend the night there, and there were always whispers about strange noises and unexplained lights. I'd never put much stock in ghost stories, but something about that place always set my teeth on edge. As we drove out of town, following the winding road into the hills, Felix was practically bouncing in his seat. "So what do you think happened? Maybe they fell down a shaft, or got lost in one of the old tunnels." "Let's not jump to conclusions," I said, keeping my eyes on the road. "Could be they just lost track of time, decided to camp an extra night, cell reception spotty up there." Felix nodded, but I could tell he was hoping for something more exciting. We drove in silence for a while, the dense forests closing in around us. The sky was overcast, a blanket of gray that seemed to press down on the treetops. As we neared the trailhead that led to the mine, I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. We parked the car and geared up. The trailhead was deserted, no sign of the missing hiker's vehicle. "All right," I said, checking my flashlight and radio. "Let's do this by the book." We followed the main trail, calling out every few minutes, "Keep your eyes peeled for any sign of recent activity." Felix nodded, his earlier excitement tempered by the eerie quiet of the forest. We set off down the trail, our footsteps muffled by the carpet of pine needles. Every few minutes we'd stop and call out, "Mendocino Police Department, can anyone hear us?" Each time our voices echoed back at us, swallowed up by the vastness of the forest. We'd been hiking for about an hour when we came across the first sign of the missing hikers. It was a campsite just off the main trail. A small tent was set up and a fire pit had been dug, though it looked like it hadn't been used recently. "Amos, over here," Felix called. He was crouched near a tree at the edge of the clearing, examining something on the ground. As I approached, I saw what had caught his attention, a backpack, partially hidden under some fallen leaves. I knelt down beside Felix, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. Carefully, I opened the backpack. Inside, we found a wallet, a cell phone, and some hiking supplies. The ID in the wallet belonged to Rhonda Tinsley, one of our missing hikers. Why would they leave their gear behind? Felix mused, scanning the surrounding area. I shook my head, a knot forming in my stomach. They wouldn't, not voluntarily. We searched the campsite thoroughly, looking for any clues as to what might have happened. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing to indicate foul play. It was as if Rhonda and her husband Glenn had simply vanished into thin air. As we finished our search of the campsite, the forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening despite the early hour. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees with an almost mournful sound. "We should press on," I said, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. They might have wandered off the trail, gotten lost. Felix nodded, his earlier enthusiasm completely gone now. We continued down the trail, our calls growing more frequent and more urgent. The path began to narrow, winding its way through increasingly dense undergrowth. The trees pressed in close, their branches seeming to reach out like gnarled fingers. We'd gone another half-mile when Felix suddenly stopped short. "Amos," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "look." I followed his gaze and felt my blood run cold. There, on a tree trunk just off the trail, was a smear of what could only be blood. It was dark, almost black, but unmistakable. "Jesus," Felix breathed, his face pale. I forced myself to approach the tree, examining the blood smear closely. It was about chest height, and there were what looked like scratch marks in the bark beneath it. "Could be animal blood," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Maybe a wounded deer passed through here." Felix gave me a look that said he didn't believe that any more than I did. We pressed on, our senses on high alert. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves set our nerves on edge. As we rounded a bend in the trail, I caught a flash of color out of the corner of my eye. "Wait," I said, holding up a hand to stop Felix. I moved off the trail, pushing through a tangle of bushes. There, caught on a branch, was a scrap of bright blue fabric. Felix came up beside me, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "That looks like it could be from a raincoat," he said. "Didn't the report say one of the hikers was wearing a blue jacket?" I nodded, carefully removing the fabric from the branch and placing it in an evidence bag. As I straightened up, something on the ground caught my eye. Pushing aside some fallen leaves, I uncovered a set of drag marks, as if something or someone had been pulled through the underbrush. Felix and I exchanged grim looks. This was no longer a simple missing persons case. Something had happened to Rhonda and Glenn Tinsley. Something violent. We followed the drag marks, moving deeper into the forest. The trail was long behind us now, and the going was tough. Thorny vines snagged at our clothes, and the uneven ground threatened to twist an ankle with every step. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, we emerged into a small clearing. In the center stood an old cabin, its weathered boards gray with age. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, and most of the windows were broken. "I didn't know there were any structures out here," Felix said, his voice hushed. I shook my head. "There shouldn't be. This isn't on any of our maps." We approached the cabin cautiously, weapons drawn. The drag marks led straight to the front door. As we got closer, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Carved into the wood above the door was a crude symbol, a circle with a jagged line through it. "What the hell is that?" Felix whispered. "I don't know," I replied, "but I don't like it. Stay sharp." I pushed the door open slowly, wincing at the loud creak of the hinges. The interior of the cabin was dark, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. I swept my flashlight across the room, revealing overturned furniture and debris scattered across the floor. As the beam of light passed over one corner of the room, Felix let out a strangled gasp. There, slumped against the wall, was a body. It was Glenn Tinsley, his face a mask of terror, his chest a bloody ruin. "Oh God," Felix choked out, turning away. I forced myself to approach the body, my police training kicking in despite the horror of the scene. Glenn had been dead for hours, his skin cold and waxy to the touch. The wounds on his chest looked like they had been made by some kind of large animal. But there was a deliberateness to them that spoke of human cruelty. As I examined the body, something caught my eye. Carved into the floorboards next to Glenn was another symbol, similar to the one above the door, but more elaborate. It looked almost like some kind of script, but not in any language I recognized. "Felix," I called, my voice sounding strange in the oppressive silence of the cabin. "We need to call this in. Get back to the car and radio for backup. I'll keep searching for Rhonda." Felix hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave me alone in this house of horrors. But he nodded, knowing that following protocol was our best chance of solving this and potentially saving Rhonda. As Felix hurried out of the cabin, I continued my search. The main room yielded no further clues, so I moved towards a door at the back of the cabin. It was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, a muffled whimper. I burst through the door, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, bound to a chair in the center of the room, was Rhonda Tinsley. She was alive, but barely. Her clothes were torn and bloody, and her eyes were wide with terror. "It's okay," I said, rushing to her side. "I'm Officer Wainwright. You're safe now." As I worked to untie her bonds, Rhonda's eyes suddenly widened even further. She was looking at something behind me, trying to speak through her gag. I turned, just in time to see a massive figure lunging out of the shadows. The impact knocked me to the ground, my flashlight skittering across the floor. I found myself face to face with something that defied description. It was vaguely humanoid, but larger, its skin a patchwork of fur and scales. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural yellow light, and its mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth. I reached for my gun, but the creature was faster, its claws raked across my chest, tearing through my uniform like it was tissue paper. The pain was excruciating, but adrenaline kept me fighting. I managed to get my hand on my weapon, pulling it free of its holster. The creature reared back, ready to strike again. I fired, the gunshot deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck the creature in the shoulder, and it let out a howl that was part animal, part human, and wholly terrifying. It staggered back, giving me enough room to scramble to my feet. I fired again and again, each shot driving the creature further back. With a final, bone-chilling shriek, it turned and crashed through one of the boarded-up windows, disappearing into the forest. My chest heaving, blood seeping through my torn uniform, I turned back to Rhonda. Her eyes were rolled back in her head. She had passed out, likely from a combination of fear and her injuries. I could hear sirens in the distance. Felix must have gotten through to dispatch. I sank to the floor beside Rhonda's chair, my gun still trained on the broken window. As the adrenaline began to fade, the pain from my wounds intensified, but worse than the physical pain was the knowledge that everything I thought I knew about the world had just been shattered. The next few hours passed in a blur. The cabin was swarming with police and paramedics. Rhonda and I were both taken to the hospital. I gave my statement, trying to describe what I had seen, but I could tell from the looks on my colleagues' faces that they didn't believe me. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. In the days and weeks that followed, an extensive search was conducted in the forest around the cabin. They found no trace of the creature I had described. The official report chalked it up to a bear attack, with my hallucination of a monster attributed to stress and blood loss. But I knew what I had seen, and I wasn't the only one. Rhonda, once she regained consciousness, told a similar story, but her account was dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized victim. Life in Mendocino gradually returned to normal, but for me, nothing would ever be the same. I found myself jumping at shadows, staying awake late into the night, staring out at the dark forests that surrounded our town. Janice tried to understand, but how could I explain the terror that now lived in my heart? Felix was changed too. The eager young cop was gone, replaced by a man who seemed to have aged years in just a few weeks. He never spoke about what he had seen in that cabin, but I could see the knowledge weighing on him. As the months passed, I threw myself into research, trying to make sense of what had happened. I pored over old town records, spoke with local historians, even reached out to experts in cryptozoology. Slowly, a picture began to emerge, a history of disappearances and strange sightings stretching back to the earliest days of Mendocino settlement. The symbol I had seen, both above the cabin door and carved next to Glenn's body, appeared in some of the oldest records. It was associated with a cult that had supposedly operated in the area in the late 1800s, a group that worshipped some kind of forest deity, but knowing the history didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made things worse, because now I knew that the threat was still out there, hiding in the shadows of our picturesque town. I'm still a cop in Mendocino. I still patrol the streets, respond to calls, fill out paperwork. But now I'm always watching, always waiting, because I know that someday that creature, or others like it, will return. And when it does, I'll be ready. So if you ever find yourself in Mendocino, enjoy the beautiful coastline, savor the wine, and bask in the small town charm. But remember, when night falls, stay close to the lights of town. And if you hear something moving in the shadows of the forest, don't dismiss it as just the wind or your imagination, because in Mendocino, the monsters are real. For 3 years after that fateful day in the forest, life in Mendocino continued with an uneasy normalcy. I went about my duties, always vigilant, always watching. Janice and the kids noticed the change in me, but I couldn't bring myself to burden them with the truth. How do you tell your family that the world is far more dangerous and mysterious than they ever imagined? Then, in the summer of 2015, it happened again. It started with reports of livestock mutilations on the outskirts of town. Farmers found their animals torn apart, the wounds similar to what I'd seen on Glenn Tinsley's body. The official explanation was mountain lions, but I knew better. I tried to convince Chief Bradshaw to take the threat seriously, to increase patrols in the affected areas. But without hard evidence, my warnings fell on deaf ears. Even Felix, who had seen the aftermath of the attack in the cabin, seemed reluctant to acknowledge that it might be happening again. Then, on a warm night in August, 16-year-old Timmy Lawson went missing. Timmy had gone into the woods behind his family's property to collect firewood. When he didn't return for dinner, his parents called it in. I was first on the scene, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and grim anticipation. As I interviewed Timmy's distraught parents, my eyes kept drifting to the treeline. The forest seemed to loom larger than ever, a wall of darkness punctuated by the rhythmic flashing of fireflies. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw a pair of yellow eyes gleaming in the shadows. But when I looked again, they were gone. We organized a search party, but I insisted that no one go into the woods until daybreak. I knew that whatever had taken Timmy, it was strongest at night. Some of the other officers grumbled about the delay, but Chief Bradshaw backed me up, perhaps sensing the urgency in my voice. That night was the longest of my life. I sat in my patrol car at the edge of the Lawson property, my eyes fixed on the forest, my hand never far from my weapon. As the hours crept by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me back, biding its time. When dawn finally broke, we began our search. I led one team, with Felix heading up another. We combed through the woods, calling Timmy's name, looking for any sign of the boy. It was Felix's team that found the first clue, Timmy's axe, abandoned in a small clearing. There was blood on the blade, and more spattered on the leaves nearby. But it was what Felix found carved into a nearby tree that made my blood run cold, the same symbol I'd seen at the cabin 3 years ago. As Felix radioed in the discovery, I noticed something else. The air had gone still, the usual forest sounds suddenly absent. And there, just visible through the trees, was a flash of blue, the same color as the jacket Timmy had been wearing. "Felix," I said, my voice low and urgent, "get everyone out of here now." He started to protest, but something in my eyes must have convinced him. As he hurried to evacuate the search teams, I drew my weapon and moved deeper into the forest. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves under my feet. I followed the occasional glimpses of blue, my every sense straining for any sign of danger. Finally, I emerged into another clearing. In the center stood a large, flat rock, its surface stained dark with what I knew instinctively was blood. And there, arranged carefully on the rock, was Timmy's blue jacket. I approached slowly, my gun at the ready. As I got closer, I saw that something had been carved into the rock's surface, a more complex version of the symbol, surrounded by what looked like ancient runes. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, coming face to face with the creature from my nightmares. It was just as I remembered, massive, inhuman, its eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. But this time I was prepared. As it lunged at me, I fired, the bullet striking it square in the chest. The creature staggered back, black ichor oozing from its wounds. But it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a roar that shook the trees and charged at me again. I dove out of the way, rolling to my feet and firing again. The creature was fast, but I managed to stay just out of reach of its deadly claws. We danced a deadly ballet through the clearing, neither of us able to gain the upper hand. As I fired my last bullet, I heard shouts in the distance, the search team coming to investigate the gunshots. The creature heard them too. It turned its head towards the sound, then back to me. In its eyes, I saw something I never expected, fear. With a final, ear-splitting shriek, it turned and fled into the forest. I gave chase, but it was too fast, quickly disappearing into the shadows between the trees. By the time Felix and the others reached me, I was alone in the clearing, my gun empty, my uniform torn and bloody. Timmy's jacket still lay on the rock, the only evidence that any of it had been real. We never found Timmy's body. The official report listed him as a probable victim of an animal attack, his remains likely scattered by scavengers. But I knew the truth, as did his comfort. In the months that followed, I threw myself into my research with renewed vigor. I reached out to experts in folklore and mythology, to cryptozoologists and paranormal investigators. Slowly, I began to piece together the truth. The creature, or creatures, for I now believed there was more than one, was ancient, part of a species that had inhabited these forests long before humans arrived. The cult I'd discovered in the town's history hadn't worshipped these beings as gods. They'd made pacts with them, offering sacrifices in exchange for dark powers. I learned that the symbols were part of an old magic, binding the creatures to certain areas. But the bindings were weakening. With each passing year, the creatures were growing bolder, ranging further from their ancient territories. Armed with this knowledge, I did what I could to protect the town. I discreetly marked the boundaries of the creature's territory with symbols of protection. I discovered in my research I worked to steer development and tourism away from the deepest, darkest parts of the forest. But I knew it was only a matter of time before the creatures struck again. And so I prepared gathering weapons, blessed by every faith I could find studying ancient texts for any weakness I could exploit. Janice worried about my obsession. The long nights spent poring over old books and stranger websites. The kids noticed too. I saw it in their eyes, the concern, the growing distance. But I couldn't stop the safety of Mendocino of my family, dependent on my vigilance. And so here I am 5 years after that first encounter in the woods, still a cop, still protecting and serving. But now, with the knowledge that the greatest threat to our town lurks, not in the hearts of men, but in the shadows of the forest, I'm writing this down as a record, a warning to those who might come after me, because I know that someday the creatures will come for me, whether out of vengeance or hunger or some alien motive. I can't fathom they'll come, and when they do, I'll be ready. So if you're reading this, if you've noticed strange symbols carved into trees or heard inhuman cries in the night, know that you're not alone. The monsters are real, but so are those who fight them. Stay vigilant, stay strong, and whatever you do, don't go into the woods alone. In 2024, I was just 13 years old. It was a quiet Friday evening, and I was sitting on the couch in our living room watching an old rerun of some cartoon I didn't really care about. The sound of rain tapping against the windows filled the house, blending with the hum of the TV. My mom was upstairs in the bathroom, getting ready for bed. She always took her time, and I knew better than to bother her during her routine. A sudden knock at the front door broke the peaceful monotony of the night. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it was enough to startle me. I hesitated, staring at the door. Who would visit us this late? I got up, my feet dragging against the carpet as I moved toward the door. Peeking through the peephole, I saw a familiar face. Mr. Dalvin, my dad's old friend. His gray hair was damp from the rain, and his expression was grave. My chest tightened. Something wasn't right. I opened the door. "Hi, Mr. Dalvin," I said, my voice shaky. "Hey, kid," he replied, his voice low and serious. "I need to talk to your mom. Your dad, he's been in an accident. He's in the hospital." My stomach dropped. "Wait here," I mumbled, bolting upstairs to get my mom. I called out to her, barely able to form the words. She rushed out of the bathroom, still wrapping her robe around herself, and hurried down to meet Mr. Dalvin. I stood at the top of the stairs, watching as he explained everything to her. She gasped, covering her mouth with one hand. Minutes later, we were in Mr. Dalvin's car, speeding through the rain-slick streets toward the hospital. The whole ride, my mom kept asking questions, but his answers were short. All I could gather was that my dad's condition was serious, and he was still in surgery. My hands gripped the seatbelt tightly, my heart pounding. When we arrived at the hospital, the sterile smell of antiseptic hit me immediately. The lights were too bright, the walls too white. Nurses and doctors moved quickly through the halls, their faces set in expressions of focus. We were directed to a waiting area outside the operating theater. My mom sat down, clutching her purse, her face pale and tense. I sat beside her, feeling completely out of place. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder with every passing second. Around 1 a.m., exhaustion took over. My mom's head was nodding as she fought to stay awake. I, on the other hand, was restless. Sitting still felt impossible, so I decided to explore the hospital. "I'll just walk around a bit," I told her. She barely responded, lost in her worry. The hallways of the hospital were dimly lit and eerily quiet at that hour. The further I wandered, the less familiar everything became. It was like the walls stretched endlessly, every turn leading to another identical corridor. My sneakers squeaked against the tiled floor, the only sound breaking the silence. Then I felt it, a presence, someone was behind me. I turned my head, just enough to catch a glimpse. A man stood at the end of the hallway, his silhouette barely visible under the faint glow of the overhead lights. He wasn't moving, just standing there watching me. My breath quickened. I kept walking, quickening my pace, hoping I was imagining things, but when I glanced back again, he was closer. My heart thudded in my chest as I tried to remember the way back to the waiting area, but every hallway looked the same. Panic set in as I realized I was lost. Up ahead, I noticed a door slightly ajar. Without thinking, I slipped inside and quietly shut the door behind me. My eyes adjusted to the dim room, and I realized where I was. Rows of metal drawers lined the walls, each one labeled with a small tag. A cold chill settled over me. I didn't know much about hospitals, but even at 13, I understood where I was. The morgue. I backed away from the drawers, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then a loud knock shattered the silence. I froze, staring at the door. The knock came again, but this time, I realized it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from one of the drawers. My legs felt like they were glued to the floor as I stared at the row of metal compartments. The knock sounded again, louder this time. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle of the drawer. Just as I was about to open it, a voice behind me made me jump. "Hey kid, what are you doing here?" I spun around to see a man in a white coat, a doctor. His face was stern, but his eyes held a hint of curiosity. There was a knock," I stammered, pointing at the drawer. He raised an eyebrow. "A knock from a morgue drawer?" He didn't wait for my answer before stepping past me and opening the drawers one by one. I watched in horror as each drawer revealed what I already feared. Pale, lifeless bodies. My stomach churned, and I took a step back, unable to process what I was seeing. "See? Nothing here but the deceased," the doctor said, his tone dismissive. But before I could respond, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps outside the room. I turned toward the door, my heart racing. The footsteps stopped, and the door creaked open slightly. Standing there was the same man who had been following me. His face was shadowed, but his intent was clear. The man's footsteps echoed behind me as I ran, my lungs burning with every breath. I turned corner after corner, hoping to lose him, but the endless hallways seemed to loop back on themselves. Just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, I heard a familiar voice. "Honey, where are you?" It was my mom. Her voice was like a lifeline, pulling me out of the nightmare. I sprinted toward the sound, tears streaming down my face. When I reached her, I collapsed into her arms, sobbing. "What happened?" she asked, her voice full of concern. I turned to point at the man, but he was gone. The hallway was empty. Later, when I calmed down, I told my mom everything. She was skeptical, but concerned enough to report it to the hospital staff. Security searched the premises, but found no one matching the description of the man who had followed me. The next morning, we spoke to the same doctor I had met in the morgue. When I told him about the knocking sound, he looked at me with a mix of confusion and pity. "You must have been dreaming," he said. "There's no way anyone could knock from inside one of those drawers." I didn't argue, but I knew what I had heard. To this day, I can still hear that knock echoing in my mind. And as for the man who followed me, he was never caught. Sometimes late at night, I wonder who he was and what he wanted. But most of all, I wonder about that sound in the morgue. Was it just my imagination, or was it something far worse? Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural, but there's something about that night that I can't explain. Something that keeps me awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything over and over again. It all started when my friends and I decided to explore the abandoned Waverly Hills Sanatorium. You've probably heard of it. It's one of the most haunted places in America. I know, cliché, right? But we weren't there for ghost stories. We were there for content. My best friend Kyle had this idea to start a YouTube channel. Ghost Hunters in the Dark, he called it. He thought it would blow up if we captured anything spooky. Then there was Mike, the skeptic in our group, and me, the one stuck somewhere in between. I didn't think we'd see anything, but I was curious enough to try. The sanatorium loomed over us like a black hole, swallowing up all the light from the full moon. Its windows were shattered, and the front doors hung open like a gaping mouth. Kyle was the most excited, bouncing with his camera in hand. Mike stayed quiet, fidgeting with his flashlight. "We'll cover more ground if we split up," Kyle suggested once we were inside. I didn't like the idea, but the building was massive, with long, winding hallways and endless rooms. It felt like a maze designed to keep you lost. Kyle argued that we could always call each other if something happened, and reluctantly we agreed. I took the west hallway, where the air felt heavy and cold. My footsteps echoed, each sound bouncing back to me from the empty walls. The rooms I passed were mostly the same, peeling paint, overturned furniture, broken glass. Some still had rusted hospital beds with torn mattresses, as the ghosts of patients lingered there. Now and then I thought I heard something faint, a whisper, a scuffle of feet, but when I stopped to listen, there was only silence. My flashlight flickered, and I tapped it nervously. Meanwhile, Kyle and Mike explored their hallways. Over the walkie-talkie, Kyle's voice crackled with updates about old operating rooms and graffiti-covered walls. Mike stayed quieter, muttering occasionally about how this was all a waste of time. I had just turned a corner when Kyle's voice broke through the static. "Guys, come to me." Now, his tone wasn't playful anymore. It was sharp and tense. "Where are you?" Mike asked, his voice equally uneasy. "East hallway, near the central staircase," Kyle replied. I started moving fast, the beam of my flashlight bobbing along the cracked tiles. I reached the staircase at the same time as Mike. Kyle was standing in the middle of the hall, his flashlight aimed at the ground. "What is it?" Mike asked out of breath. Kyle didn't answer right away. He just pointed. There on the floor was a white sheet. At first I thought it was just trash, but it wasn't crumpled like trash usually is. It was smooth, and the way it rose slightly in the middle, it looked like something was underneath. I felt a lump in my throat. "Is someone?" I didn't finish the sentence. Kyle nodded. "I think so. I thought it was just a blanket at first, but it's too neat, and it's not moving." Mike scoffed, trying to hide his fear. "Probably a homeless guy sleeping. Let's just leave." But Kyle shook his head. "We need to check. What if they're hurt?" Neither of us argued. Kyle was always the brave one. Kyle knelt next to the sheet, his flashlight still trained on it. His hand hovered over the edge. "Stay back," he said. I don't know why, but I grabbed Mike's arm, squeezing hard. There was something wrong about that sheet, something I couldn't put into words. Kyle hesitated for a moment, then reached out. He pinched the edge of the cloth between his fingers and started to lift it. That's when he screamed. It wasn't a startled yell or a shout for attention. It was the kind of scream that curdles your blood, raw and primal. He shot to his feet, dropping the flashlight, and before I could process what was happening, he was running. Mike and I didn't wait to ask questions. We bolted after him, our footsteps pounding through the dark, our breath ragged. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for air under the pale light of the moon. Kyle was pacing, his hands shaking. "What did you see?" Mike demanded. Kyle didn't look at us right away. His eyes were wide, staring at the ground. Finally, he whispered. There were eyes under the sheet, glowing bright yellow, staring right at me. Mike and I exchanged a look, but neither of us spoke. "We need to call the cops," Kyle said. "What if it's a body or someone dangerous?" The police arrived about 20 minutes later. We led them to the spot, but when we got there, the sheet was gone. The officers searched the area, but there was nothing. No sheet, no body, no glowing eyes. Just an empty hallway. They took our statements, though I could tell they didn't believe us. One of them, an older guy with a tired face, pulled me aside. "You know," he said, "there's a story about this place. They say some of the patients never left. Maybe you kids should stay away." Later that night, after we'd gone home, we reviewed the footage. Kyle's camera had been rolling the whole time. We fast-forwarded to the part where he approached the sheet. The video showed Kyle kneeling, his hand reaching out, and then static. When the image returned, the camera was on the ground, pointing at our retreating feet. We never uploaded the video. We never went back to the sanatorium, either. Kyle stopped talking about glowing eyes after a while, but I know he still sees them in his nightmares. In the 1990s, my wife, who was my girlfriend back then, worked at a hospital that had a long history. This hospital was originally built in the 1800s and later transformed into a palliative care facility. It was interesting to think about how many years it had been serving the community in different ways. New modern wings were built, and there was also a section with low-care units. These units looked like single-level cabins nestled in a lovely garden setting. They were designed for people who could still take care of themselves, but needed to be nearby in case they required medical help. Some of the original old buildings were still being used, and they had many places where cold drafts came in, doors that were hard to open, and other problems that needed attention. One of the most interesting things was a door that could lock all by itself. Then, just a few seconds later, it would unlock again, and there was no one nearby to turn the lock. It was quite mysterious and made people wonder how it happened. So my wife would get a ride to work and back home with a neighbor who worked at the same place. However, on Fridays, that neighbor would finish her work around lunchtime. To make sure my wife could continue working a full day, I would drive to pick her up after her shift. The drive took about 40 minutes each way, allowing me to be there for her when she finished her work. Since the traffic could be very unpredictable, I always made sure to leave an hour early to reach my destination on time. I would sit patiently outside the cozy brick cottage that served as an office, resting on a weathered old church pew. Some of the older people living in the low-care units would stroll around the lovely grounds, which were set in a beautiful rural area. As they walked, they would greet everyone with a friendly hello. After a few weeks, I got to know Ken better. He was in his 80s and lived in a low-care facility where he received assistance with daily activities. He faced some ongoing problems that made him spend several days in the hospital. After that, he would return home for a few weeks to rest and recover. He carefully planned my routine, and every Friday, he would be sitting on that familiar church pew, patiently waiting for me to arrive. I liked having a conversation with him. It was nice to share thoughts and ideas. He had a wealth of life experiences and had seen and done many things during his younger years. He loved to share those stories, and I found so much joy in listening to every single one of them. Ken owned a classic Toyota Celica from the 1980s. It was a stylish car that turned heads wherever he drove it. The sleek lines and vibrant color made it stand out on the road, and Ken loved the way it felt to be behind the wheel of such a memorable vehicle. He could no longer drive the car, but he felt a strong reluctance to part with it. Whenever his family visited him, he would ask them to take him for a ride in it. He often asked me to take him out for a drive, but I hardly knew him at all. The thought of driving a car that I wasn't familiar with made me feel uneasy, and I wasn't sure I wanted to do it. In addition, I had just about 20 minutes left before I would be heading out on my journey. Ken loved to play golf. He spent many hours on the golf course, enjoying the fresh air and the challenge of the game. He shared with me that his son would come to see him every week, a fact my wife also confirmed. During these visits, they would take the Celica out for a drive together. I thought they were planning to go play golf. Ken would share stories about how well he performed. He would share stories about hitting a ball deep into the thick grass, or making 3 birdies one after another. He would also keep track of how many balls ended up in the water. Every week brought a new tale. On some weeks, he would find himself 3 over par after his handicap adjustments were made. At other times, he played exceptionally well and managed to be 1 stroke under par after taking his handicap into account. I didn't really enjoy golf myself, but my dad and brother played it all the time, so I knew a lot about the game. Each of his stories was unique, filled with interesting details, and told in a way that captivated everyone who listened. After we finished talking about the exciting highlights from the week's golf game, he would share with me his experiences as a young man in the Air Force. He had many fascinating stories from World War II that he loved to recount. He worked in the Air Force for many years as a mechanic. Over time, he became a team leader, guiding his fellow mechanics. He also took on the important role of training new mechanics and sharing his knowledge and skills with them. After some time, he took on the role of a trade teacher at a technical college. He dedicated about 10 years to this job, sharing his knowledge and skills with students before he finally decided to retire. He shared many tales about creating new parts from whatever materials they could find to make things function properly. There were stories of failures and amusing incidents that happened in the workshop, and then there were the funny stories from his college days. It was a treasure trove of entertainment for me. As the weeks went by, I noticed that I was starting to leave work earlier and earlier on Fridays. I wanted to make sure I had plenty of time to enjoy his company and create special moments together. Sometimes I would arrive, and he wouldn't be around. My wife would then explain to me that he was in the hospital for a little while. I started to feel like I missed our little conversations. After about 9 months of this, everything started to change. This Friday felt like a return to our usual routine. He was no longer in the hospital and was sitting beside me on the church pew once again. He shared the story of the golf game they played during the week. I needed to use the restroom, so I politely asked to be excused so I could go. When I returned, he was no longer there. I shared the news with my wife, and she responded, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot to mention it, but Ken passed away earlier this week." But I was right there, having a conversation with him, just before I went to the bathroom. He shared with me all the exciting details about the golf game. How could that possibly happen? Do you really think it's the same, Ken? The next week, I saw that his car was no longer parked in its usual place under the carport of his unit. Instead, it had been moved to the visitors' parking area, which was quite different from where it normally was. Instead of the usual vehicle, there was a big 4-wheel drive parked there. It had a large trailer attached to the back, and the trailer was partly filled with various pieces of furniture and several boxes stacked on top of each other. It caused me to pause and think for a moment. It felt like a sign that he was gone, but deep down, I still held on to the hope that he was alive and doing okay. After all, just a week before, we had been chatting and sharing stories. I strolled down to the unit and discovered his son busy sorting through the things inside. I took a moment to share my name and a little about who I am. He was aware of me. Ken had shared details about our conversations on Fridays. He said that his dad had died the Tuesday before. I didn't want to make him feel bad, so I decided to stay silent about our conversation from the week before, just 3 days after he had passed away. But now I had proof that it wasn't Ken's human body sitting on that church pew and talking to me. He continued by saying that his dad enjoyed being in front of people, and he hoped that he wasn't making me feel bored. In fact, it is very different from what you might think. We chatted for a little while about some of the amusing stories from the war and shared experiences from the Air Force. I mentioned how amazed I was that Ken still had such a sharp mind and could remember every detail of our golf games from each week. He looked very confused, as if he was trying to understand something that didn't make sense to him. "Would you like to play a game of golf?" Yes, he would share all the details of each week's game, describing everything that happened. He then shared with me that Ken hadn't picked up a golf club in at least 10 years. I was completely shocked and couldn't believe what I was seeing. His son shared that every Thursday he would pick up Ken. They would first go to the cemetery to visit the grave of Ken's wife. After that, they would head to a cozy cafe for lunch together. Once they finished eating, they would do some grocery shopping. Finally, they would stop to fill up the car with fuel before heading back home. It takes about 4 to 5 hours in total. I would like to know approximately how much time he might need to complete a round of golf. He did not say anything about any of those activities at all. It really surprises me how he could remember so many details. The golf stories must have come from his own past experiences, because the way he described everything in such detail was just too vivid to be imagined.